My name is Riley, and at 30 years old, I found myself 8 months pregnant and staring at divorce papers slammed onto my half-assembled nursery crib. The man demanding the divorce was my husband of 4 years, Carter, and the woman standing right behind him rubbing her own growing pregnant belly was my best friend of 10 years, Blair. They thought they were discarding a boring number-crunching wife to run off with their hidden millions. I happily agreed to sign those papers without shedding a single tear because what they did not realize was that a forensic accountant always reads the fine print. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought you were weak and oblivious. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening in the nursery of our suburban home. The walls were freshly painted a soft sage green, and the smell of new wood filled the air. I was sitting on the floor, heavily pregnant, my back aching as I wrestled with an Allen wrench trying to put together a wooden crib for our son. Carter, my husband, and a high-profile wealth manager had promised to help me build it over the weekend, but he claimed a sudden financial conference required his undivided attention. I was wiping sweat from my forehead when the nursery door swung open. Carter did not offer a greeting. He walked straight past the half-finished crib and slammed a thick manila folder onto the changing dresser. The heavy thud echoed against the bare walls, making me jump. I looked up, expecting an apology for his absence or maybe a complaint about a difficult client. Instead, I saw a cold, calculated expression on his face that I had never seen before. He was dressed in his signature tailored navy suit, looking every bit the successful financial guru he projected himself to be. "I need you to sign these right now," Carter said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. I pulled myself up from the floor, resting a hand on my heavy stomach for balance. "Sign what I asked," genuinely confused by his hostility. He tapped the folder. "Divorce papers. We are done, Riley. I need an elite partner who matches my ambition, not a boring number-crunching workaholic who brings nothing to my public image." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air in the room suddenly felt thin and suffocating. Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of his statement, a second figure stepped into the nursery doorway. It was Blair, my best friend of 10 years. The woman who had been my maid of honor, the person I had shared every secret with since our college days. She was wearing a clinging emerald silk slip dress that perfectly highlighted her own slightly protruding belly. She walked into the room with an undeniable swagger, placing a manicured hand protectively over her stomach. "Hey, Bestie," Blair said, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. "Sorry to drop in like this, but Carter and I agreed it was time to stop pretending." I stared at her, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between the woman I knew and the stranger standing in my home. "Carter and I have been together for months," Blair continued, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "And honestly, Riley, you should thank me for stepping aside. You were never meant for his world. You belong behind a desk with your spreadsheets, not hosting charity galas." The absolute audacity of her words paralyzed me. This was the same Blair who had sat at my kitchen table crying 5 years ago when she failed her real estate exam for the second time. The same Blair I had patiently tutored for weeks, breaking down complex property tax codes and financing models so she could finally pass and get her license to sell high-end homes. Now she was standing in my house, pregnant with my husband's child, mocking the very skills I had used to build her career. Carter stepped closer to her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "It is nothing personal, Riley," he said, looking at me as if I were a stranger begging for spare change. "Blair and I are building an empire. She moves real estate for the city elite and I manage their wealth. We are a power couple. You are a forensic accountant who wears practical shoes and talks about auditing procedures. You do not fit the narrative I need for my brand anymore. Plus, Blair is giving me the kind of family I actually want." The betrayal was sudden, absolute, and utterly suffocating. My husband and my best friend had not just stabbed me in the back, they were twisting the knife and expecting me to thank them for it. A lesser woman might have screamed, thrown the Allen wrench, or collapsed into hysterics. But my professional training kicked in. When you spend your life hunting down corporate fraud and tracking anomalies in financial data, you learn to detach your emotions from the facts. And the facts presented in this room were highly irregular. I looked at the thick stack of papers on the dresser. Divorces involving significant assets usually took months of mediation, tense negotiations with lawyers, and endless financial disclosures. Yet here was Carter shoving a fully drafted agreement in my face on a random Tuesday, desperate for my immediate signature. He was sweating slightly at the temples despite his cool demeanor. His eyes darted nervously between the folder and my face. He was in a frantic, barely concealed rush. I took a deep breath, feeling my baby kick against my ribs, and walked slowly toward the dresser. I looked down at the top page of the legal packet. My eyes immediately locked onto a specific paragraph bolded near the bottom. It was a complete relinquishment of joint liability, severing all my ties to his businesses and debts, effective immediately upon signing. I looked back up at them, offering a cold, unnerving smile. "Just how big of a hurry are you in?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I will review these. Now get out of my house." Carter scoffed, grabbing Blair by the hand and leading her out of the nursery, confident he had already won. The moment the front door slammed shut downstairs, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an encrypted text message from an unknown number. It read, "Do not sign anything yet. Meet me tonight. Jamal." Segment 2. The Financial Trap. 1,000 words. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the name of Jamal burning into my retinas. Jamal was married to Carter's sister, Nicole, making him my brother-in-law. He was also the lead cybersecurity architect at Carter's wealth management firm. He was a quiet, observant man possessing a strict moral compass that always felt out of place among my in-laws. For him to reach out directly on an encrypted channel meant something massive was happening. I slipped the device into the pocket of my jeans and turned my attention back to the legal packet Carter had abandoned on the changing table. My hands were entirely steady as I flipped open the manila folder. Carter had clearly intended to use my physical state as a weapon. He assumed an 8-month pregnant woman exhausted from assembling baby furniture and blindsided by a brutal betrayal would just dissolve into tears and sign whatever was pushed in front of her. He was banking on my compliance and fear, but as my eyes scanned the legal jargon, the betrayed wife vanished, and the senior forensic accountant took over. I read through the terms, and the sheer audacity of his financial demands was staggering. Carter had structured the agreement to strip me of absolutely everything we had built together over the last 4 years. He would retain full ownership of our suburban estate. He demanded to keep both luxury vehicles. Most ruthlessly, the paperwork laid claim to the entirety of our joint savings and investment portfolios. In exchange for walking away quietly, he offered me a laughably minuscule payout. It was a financial slaughter, designed to leave me destitute and completely dependent on whatever meager child support he felt obligated to pay. But it was not the blatant theft of our assets that triggered my professional alarms. It was page 14. I ran my finger down the page, stopping at a highly irregular paragraph buried deep within the standard indemnification clauses. It was a total retroactive and perpetual relinquishment of joint liability. The legal phrasing was specifically drafted to shield Carter and his corporate entities from any future civil, criminal, or tax-related liabilities. It placed the burden of proving ignorance entirely on me while forcing me to surrender any right to access his future financial disclosures. You do not demand a blanket immunity clause protecting you from federal prosecution unless you are actively engaging in activities that warrant federal prosecution. My mind raced. Wealth managers dealing with high net worth clients operated under strict regulatory scrutiny. Carter had always been arrogant, but he was never sloppy. For him to demand an immediate divorce, flaunt his affair with Blair, and shove an ironclad liability shield in my face, it meant one thing. He was terrified. He was in a desperate, frantic rush to sever all financial ties to me before a massive storm broke. He needed me off his books. I thought back to the smirk on his face just minutes ago and the venomous triumph in Blair's voice. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was just a boring auditor who could easily be swept under the rug while they rode off into the sunset with their stolen wealth. But they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Carter wanted a trophy wife who asked no questions. He forgot that I spent my days dissecting complex corporate fraud and hunting down missing millions for a living. I closed the folder, cold clarity settling over me. I walked over to the nursery window, looking out at the darkened street. I placed a protective hand over my stomach, feeling a strong, reassuring kick against my palm. I was not going to let these people ruin my son's future. I was going to dismantle their entire empire brick by fraudulent brick. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. I had 2 hours before my midnight meeting with Jamal. I moved to my home office, working methodically, despite the heavy ache in my lower back. I booted up my personal laptop, a highly secured device I used for independent contracting work. I packed it into a sleek black tote bag, along with a pair of encrypted flash drives, a portable battery bank, and a secure hotspot. I was preparing for an absolute digital war. I changed out of my maternity clothes and put on a dark trench coat that masked my silhouette. As I moved through our home, the house that Carter was trying to steal from under my feet, I felt no sentimental attachment. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph of our supposedly perfect life, now looked like evidence in a crime scene. I grabbed my car keys and slipped out the side door into the cool night air. The drive downtown was a blur of neon lights and quiet intersections. The location Jamal had chosen was a dilapidated parking garage beneath an abandoned commercial complex. I pulled my sedan into the second sublevel, the tires echoing loudly against the damp concrete. I parked in the darkest corner, keeping my headlights off and the engine running. A few tense minutes passed. Then a pair of headlights swept across the concrete pillars as a black sedan pulled into the space opposite mine. The engine cut off and the driver's side door opened. Jamal stepped out into the dim yellow light of a flickering overhead bulb, wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a heavy metallic briefcase. I stepped out to meet him directly. There were no friendly hugs, no polite inquiries about my pregnancy. We were two people trapped in the orbit of a toxic family, finally joining forces to break the cycle. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes scanning the empty garage before locking onto mine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, holding it out to me in the palm of his hand. It was a high-capacity encrypted USB drive, the absolute key to Carter's destruction. I reached out and took the drive from his extended hand. The metal casing was ice-cold against my skin. Jamal did not offer a comforting smile, and he did not bother asking how I was holding up. At 34 years old, Jamal was a man who operated entirely on logic, precision, and digital architecture. As a brilliant Black African-American tech security expert, he possessed a mind that functioned like an unyielding steel trap. He had married Carter's sister Nicole 5 years ago, drawn in by the same polished, affluent charm that had initially fooled me. But just like me, Jamal had eventually seen behind the heavy velvet curtain. We were the outsiders, the two competent professionals who had married into a family of arrogant vipers. The underground garage was suffocatingly damp, smelling strongly of old motor oil and decaying concrete. A rusted pipe dripped steadily somewhere in the deep shadows, marking the seconds like a ticking clock. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the pristine, climate-controlled suburban estate I had just left behind. But this dark, forgotten sublevel at midnight was exactly where the truth belonged. I slipped the drive into the deep pocket of my dark trench coat, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his. "What exactly is on this drive?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly off the massive concrete pillars. Jamal leaned back against the hood of his sedan, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked thoroughly exhausted, carrying the heavy burden of someone who had stared into a digital abyss and realized the floor was missing. "System logs," he replied, his tone hushed and urgent. "Network traffic anomalies, server access records, and highly encrypted ledger packets. I am the lead security architect for your husband's firm, Riley. I built the firewalls. I designed the internal intrusion detection protocols. Carter thinks because his signature is on my paycheck, he actually understands the complex systems I put in place. He absolutely does not." Jamal explained that over the past 3 weeks, his automated back-end monitors had flagged a massive spike in unauthorized data transfers. These were not standard client portfolio updates or routine market adjustments that occurred during regular business hours. Huge packets of dense encrypted data were being routed out of the wealth management firm's primary servers, bypassing standard compliance software. The information was bouncing through proxy nodes in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus before vanishing entirely into offshore digital vaults. Furthermore, the transfers only occurred in the dead of night between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the downtown office building was completely empty. He thinks he is covering his tracks by using ghost servers and dummy IP addresses, Jamal said, shaking his head in absolute disgust. But he is leaving digital footprints everywhere in the system architecture. I started pulling the raw data dumps a week ago, keeping them entirely isolated off the main company network. At first, I suspected he was simply moving liquid capital to hide it from you in the impending divorce. I figured he was just being the selfish, arrogant prick we all know he is. But Riley, the volume of the data, the sheer monumental scale of the capital being routed offshore, it does not make any mathematical sense. It is entirely too big. This is not just about keeping you from getting the house or the joint savings account. The truth is far darker than a simple divorce shield. A sudden chill ran down my spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the damp garage air. Carter managed hundreds of millions of dollars for the city's most elite and demanding residents. If Jamal was right, the financial implications were catastrophic. "Why are you risking your own neck to give me this?" I asked, gripping the edges of my coat against the cold. "You are his brother-in-law. If Carter catches you pulling this restricted data, he will ruin your career and drag you through federal court." Jamal let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The sound was sharp and devoid of any real humor. "Because I am utterly done with all of them," he stated flatly. "The toxic hypocrisy of my wife's family makes me physically sick to my stomach. Nicole is exactly like Carter. She lies as easily as she breathes, and she expects me to blindly finance her ridiculous high society lifestyle while treating me like the hired help rather than a husband. I have watched them look down on you for years, mocking your middle-class background while exploiting your accounting skills whenever it suited their needs. They do the exact same thing to me behind closed doors." He pushed himself off the car, standing tall in the dim yellow light of the flickering overhead bulb. "I am quietly preparing my own exit strategy," Jamal confessed, his voice steady with resolve. "I have already secured my personal assets and moved my own capital into protected accounts that Nicole cannot touch. I am currently lining up a new position at a premier cybersecurity firm on the West Coast. The moment I am legally protected and the ink is dry on my new contract, I am serving her papers and walking away from this nightmare forever." But when I saw what Carter was doing to the network, I knew I could not just pack up and leave. I knew he was going to try to utterly destroy you. I felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with the heavy reality of our situation. We were forming a dangerous alliance in the dark, two prisoners coordinating a flawless jailbreak. "I need you to be my inside man," I told him, my professional instincts fully engaging. "I cannot access his firm's internal servers without triggering the external security protocols. If I am going to decode these offshore ledgers and figure out exactly what Carter is hiding, I need a constant, uninterrupted feed of his digital movements." Jamal nodded firmly, confirming our pact. "You will have it." I set up a stealth backdoor protocol that silently mirrors his direct access logs. It updates every 12 hours to a highly secure cloud drop. The credentials to access it are in a hidden text file on that drive. Do not communicate with me on our regular phones or email accounts. Use the encrypted messaging application I installed on the burner device I hid inside the drive casing. If Carter or Blair get even a hint that we are working together, they will scrub the servers clean and destroy the hard drives before you can build a solid case. "I understand," I replied. The mention of Blair's name sent a fresh surge of cold adrenaline through my veins, temporarily pushing away the physical fatigue of carrying a child. "I will crack the ledgers tonight. I will find exactly where the money is going, and then we bring their entire fraudulent empire crashing down." Jamal offered a brief, grim smile, a silent acknowledgement of the war we were officially declaring against the family that had used us. He got back into his black sedan, starting the powerful engine with a low, steady hum. I stood in the damp concrete space and watched his taillights disappear up the steep ramp, leaving me alone in the shadows. I gripped the USB drive tightly in my coat pocket, feeling the sharp edges of the metal casing. The missing pieces of the puzzle were finally in my hands. It was time to go back to my empty house, plug in my laptop, and do what I did best: follow the numbers. The drive back to the suburbs was a quiet blur of empty streets and amber streetlights. Once inside my kitchen, I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. The house was dead silent, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside my mind. I sat down at the heavy oak dining table, setting my secure laptop in front of me. I pulled the small metallic USB drive from my trench coat pocket and plugged it into the encrypted port. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh bluish glow across my face and illuminating the quiet kitchen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I dove in. Using the hidden text file Jamal had mentioned, I accessed the heavily partitioned server drops. The sheer volume of raw network data was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of transaction logs, IP routing tables, and encrypted client portfolios flooded my screen. To an untrained eye, it looked like an endless, chaotic matrix of random code and meaningless digits, but to a forensic accountant, it was a roadmap. I opened my proprietary tracking software, a custom suite I had built specifically for unraveling complex corporate webs. I imported the raw logs and began running sequencing algorithms, searching for patterns in the chaos. I started by looking for the obvious. Usually, when a spouse is trying to hide money before a divorce, they transfer funds into offshore accounts or bury capital inside obscure mutual funds. I expected to find a few $1 million neatly tucked away in the Cayman Islands, waiting for the ink to dry on our settlement. But as I peeled back the first layer of dummy corporations, it became abundantly clear that this was not a simple case of domestic financial infidelity. The anomalies were not just large, they were systemic. Carter was not moving his own money. He was moving client money. It took me exactly 15 minutes to trace the origin of the offshore routing. I tracked a massive wire transfer back through 3 different shell companies in Cyprus, only to watch the digital trail loop right back into Carter's primary wealth management portfolio. He was bleeding his clients dry. He was targeting the high-yield retirement funds of elderly investors, siphoning off huge chunks of their life savings and replacing the missing capital with fabricated return statements. He was running a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme right out of his sleek downtown office. But the money could not just sit in offshore accounts. To be useful, it had to be cleaned and reintroduced into the domestic economy. I kept following the digital breadcrumbs, my fingers flying across the keys, as I traced the laundered funds flowing out of the offshore vaults and into a localized network of limited liability companies. I cross-referenced the domestic LLCs against state registry databases. The registered agent for every single shell company was a boutique legal firm tied directly to Blair's high-end real estate brokerage. The entire monstrous operation suddenly clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Carter was stealing the retirement funds to generate untraceable cash. He wired that cash to the offshore dummy corporations to wash it clean. Then the money was routed back stateside into Blair's network of shell companies. Blair used her elite real estate license and insider connections to purchase massive multi-million-dollar luxury mansions completely in cash. She bought these ghost properties under the names of the LLCs, leaving absolutely no trace of her or Carter on the actual property deeds. They were washing stolen federal funds through high society real estate. I sat back in my kitchen chair, the breath catching in my throat. I looked toward the hallway where the divorce papers still sat in the nursery. Carter had been aggressively demanding that he retain full ownership of our joint savings, our investment portfolios, and his business assets. He wanted me to sign away all my rights to those accounts, leaving me with pennies. But those accounts were not assets at all. They were a federal ticking time bomb. Every single cent tied to his name was radioactive. If I had blindly fought to keep half of his wealth in the divorce, the FBI would have eventually seized it all and likely indicted me as a co-conspirator. His rush to get me to sign that ironclad liability waiver was not just about greed. It was about ensuring that when the federal government finally caught up with him, I could not claim I was entitled to any of the properties they had bought with stolen money. I felt a sharp, strong kick against my ribs, a stark reminder of exactly what I was fighting to protect. I took a deep, steadying breath and initiated a mass secure download, copying every single ledger, every fake invoice, and every offshore routing number directly onto my encrypted hard drive. I was gathering the exact ammunition required to obliterate them. Just as the progress bar hit 99%, the harsh trill of my cell phone shattered the quiet kitchen. The caller ID flashed on the screen, displaying the name of Carter's mother, Eleanor. I let it ring 3 times, allowing my heart rate to settle before I picked it up. I pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my voice perfectly flat and neutral. "Hello, Eleanor." Riley, her voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with her signature brand of aristocratic condescension. "Carter tells me you are making this entire separation process unnecessarily difficult. We are a respectable family, and we do not drag our private matters through drawn-out legal battles. You are coming to the estate tomorrow evening for a family dinner. We are going to sit down like civilized adults, discuss the terms of this divorce, and finalize the paperwork so we can all move on." She did not ask if I was available. She did not ask how I was feeling at 8 months pregnant. She issued a royal decree, fully expecting me to bow my head and comply, just as I always had. I looked at my laptop screen. The download complete notification flashed in bright green. I now held undeniable federal evidence that her precious, successful son was a massive fraud who had gambled away his entire future. The irony of her demanding a civilized dinner to protect their respectable family reputation was almost too sweet to bear. I closed the laptop, sliding the encrypted drive safely into my pocket. "Of course, Eleanor," I replied, my tone completely even and accommodating. "I will be there tomorrow night. We can definitely discuss exactly what Carter is walking away with." I hung up the phone without waiting for her reply. The quiet, submissive wife they all thought they knew was officially dead. I accepted the invitation because a dinner with the in-laws was the perfect stage. I was walking into their elite fortress not as a discarded spouse, but as a financial executioner armed with a lethal secret. I pulled my practical mid-sized sedan up the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling estate, parking between a pristine Bentley and a sleek Porsche. The towering mahogany front doors of my in-laws' home usually intimidated me, but tonight, knowing exactly what funded their extravagant lifestyle, the stone columns and manicured hedges just looked like evidence. Taking a deep breath to settle the flutter of my unborn son, I pushed the heavy doors open and walked straight through the marble foyer toward the formal dining room. The clinking of crystal and low murmurs drifted down the hallway. I stepped through the arched threshold, and the hostility in the room hit me like a physical wall of ice. The long, polished mahogany dining table was set for 5. At the head sat Eleanor, radiating her usual icy superiority. To her right sat Carter, looking smug and perfectly relaxed in a tailored suit. And directly across from him, sitting in the exact chair I had occupied at every family gathering for the last 4 years, was Blair. She offered a mocking, close-lipped smile as I walked in, casually lifting her hand to trace the jewelry resting against her collarbone. My stomach gave a sharp jolt. It was a spectacular vintage diamond necklace. It was a family heirloom that Eleanor had dramatically sworn on the day of my wedding would only be worn by the mother of her very first grandchild. Blair was wearing it like a war trophy, flaunting her pregnancy and her total victory over my life. Eleanor did not bother standing or offering a greeting. She pointed a manicured finger toward the empty chair at the far drafty end of the table. "Sit down, Riley," she commanded, treating me like a disobedient employee rather than her daughter-in-law. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries. Carter has explained the situation, and frankly, I completely agree with his decision. You need to sign the settlement papers he gave you yesterday and walk away quietly without causing a scene." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her vintage wine, her eyes dragging over my modest maternity clothes with pure disdain. "We always knew your middle-class background would eventually become a liability," she stated, her voice echoing in the large room. "You simply lack the pedigree required to navigate our social circles. You have no understanding of legacy. Carter needs a partner who elevates his brand and matches his elite ambition. Blair has exceptional high society real estate connections that are bringing tremendous value to our family portfolio. You, on the other hand, are just a drab accountant. You have no vision for wealth." A sharp, melodic laugh interrupted the heavy silence. I glanced to my left and saw Nicole Carter's younger sister leaning back in her plush chair and twirling a crystal stemware glass. Honestly, Riley Mom is right, Nicole sneered, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. You have always been such a stressful buzzkill. You never fit into this family. Every time we host a charity event or go on a yacht trip, you are either working on your boring spreadsheets or complaining about a budget. You completely lack our elite mindset. Blair is fun. She understands how wealth actually works, and she knows how to enjoy it. You just drag everyone down. I stood at the end of the table, resting my hands on the high back of the empty wooden chair, refusing to sit down and accept their abuse. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of these people was astounding. They sat there draped in stolen luxury, lecturing me about pedigree and wealth, while I had the encrypted proof of their massive federal crimes burning a hole in my pocket. My gaze snapped from Nicole to Eleanor, my voice ringing out clear and razor-sharp. My boring spreadsheets, I asked, allowing a cold, harsh laugh to escape my lips. Is that what you call them now, Nicole? Because 3 years ago, when your father's offshore accounts triggered a crippling IRS audit that was about to seize this exact house and freeze every single asset you own, no one called me a buzzkill. I watched the color rapidly drain from Eleanor's face as I leaned forward, gripping the polished wood of the chair. I spent 4 sleepless weeks untangling your chaotic, fraudulent tax returns, legally shielding this family from federal prosecution, and saving you millions in penalties. I did it without charging you a dime, and I never uttered a single word of complaint. I kept you out of federal prison. You begged for my middle-class skills when you were terrified of losing your precious country club memberships. The dining room fell into a deathly silence. Carter opened his mouth to intervene, his face flushing red with anger, but I cut him off with a lethal glare. "Do not speak," I commanded, my voice dripping with absolute authority. "You wanted me here to discuss the divorce. So let us discuss it." You sit there draped in diamonds and arrogance, celebrating Blair's real estate connections. You praise her for moving high-end properties and bringing value to your portfolio. You think she is elevating your family name. But I know exactly how wealth works in this room. I know exactly how those properties are being funded. I let my eyes drift deliberately from Carter's pale, sweating face to Blair's suddenly tense posture, letting the weight of my unspoken knowledge hang heavy in the air. The verbal sparring had cut straight through the bone, laying bare the toxic foundation of their entire existence. I saw the brief flash of panic in Carter's eyes as he wondered just how much of his financial web I had unraveled. I was no longer the submissive, accommodating wife they could bully into a corner. I was looking at them not as family members but as targets. They had invited me to this dinner to break my spirit and force my signature on those divorce papers, but they had severely miscalculated my strength. I held their entire fraudulent future in the palm of my hand, and I was ready to execute my next move. The vintage diamond necklace resting against Blair's chest suddenly looked less like a trophy and more like a heavy, sparkling noose. I held my ground at the end of their lavish table, breathing evenly and watching them squirm under the weight of their own hypocrisy. They wanted a war over assets and reputation, and I was more than happy to give them exactly that. But as I stood there, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, cold logic suddenly sliced through my hot anger. My forensic training overrode my desire for immediate vengeance. If I declared war tonight and exposed what I knew, Carter would instantly lock down his assets and destroy the servers. A contested divorce involving hundreds of millions of dollars would drag through the family courts for years. I would remain legally and financially tethered to his name, his firm, and his fraudulent tax returns. When the federal authorities inevitably unraveled the massive Ponzi scheme, my name would be right there next to his on the federal subpoenas. I did not just need to expose him. I needed to sever my legal liability entirely, and I needed to do it right now. I needed him to execute that indemnification agreement before the FBI raided his sleek downtown office. Fighting them with pride was a tactical error. I needed to let them win. I let the silence stretch for another brutal second, holding their furious glares. Then I blinked rapidly. I allowed my shoulders to physically slump, dropping the rigid, aggressive posture of a corporate auditor and sinking heavily into the hard wooden chair. I forced my breathing to hitch, channeling the very real exhaustion of the past 24 hours, the deep, crushing betrayal of my marriage, and the immense physical toll of carrying a child. I brought a trembling hand to my face, letting the first manufactured tear spill over my lower lashes. I cannot, I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly in the cavernous room. I just cannot do this anymore. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and palpable. The defensive tension broke immediately, replaced by a sudden predatory eagerness. Eleanor exchanged a triumphant, knowing glance with Blair. Carter leaned back in his chair, his arrogant, dismissive smirk returning in full force. I am so tired, I sobbed, letting the tears flow freely now, burying my face in my hands. You win. All of you. You want the house, then take it. You want the savings, then keep them. I do not care about the money anymore. I just want to be away from the constant emotional abuse of this family. Nicole let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. Finally. I thought we were going to have to listen to a self-righteous lecture all night. God, you are such a dramatic burden, Riley. I ignored her, looking directly at Carter through my wet lashes. I will sign your papers, every single page. I will walk away with absolutely nothing. But I need one thing from you, Carter. He crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me as if I were a pathetic insect. And what exactly is that? Page 14. I said, my voice shaking with perfectly calculated desperation. The indemnification clause. I want it completely ironclad. I want to be entirely absolved of your businesses, your corporate debts, and any future liabilities. I do not want to be tied to your firm or your investments in any capacity. I just want a clean break to protect my baby's peace. I do not want your creditors or your angry clients ever coming after me when the market turns and your investments go bad. Carter let out a sharp, barking laugh. He actually slapped the polished mahogany table in genuine amusement. Eleanor joined in with a refined, cruel chuckle. They absolutely ate it up. They thought my request was born of pure cowardice. They assumed I was simply terrified of standard corporate debt, completely ignorant of the massive financial empire he was supposedly building. They had no idea I was meticulously insulating myself from a lengthy federal prison sentence. Protect your baby's peace, Blair mocked, adjusting her stolen diamond necklace with a venomous sneer. How incredibly noble and utterly pathetic. Fine, Carter sneered, pulling a sleek silver pen from his tailored jacket pocket and tossing it across the table. It clattered to a stop right in front of me. If you want to walk away completely destitute just to avoid a little corporate liability, I am more than happy to oblige. You sign the waiver relinquishing all claims to our joint assets, and I agree to assume full sole responsibility for all corporate entities and future liabilities. We file it in the morning. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers. I pulled the thick divorce packet from my tote bag, flipping directly to the signature pages. I let a few tears drop onto the legal paper, smudging the black ink slightly for added effect. I signed my name on every line, officially relinquishing the suburban estate, the luxury cars, and the heavily padded bank accounts. And then, with a silent prayer of absolute victory, I signed the indemnification clause, forever severing my legal liability from Carter's massive Ponzi scheme. I pushed the packet across the table. Carter snatched it up hastily, adding his own signature to the binding agreement, sealing his own fate with arrogant glee. He thought he was robbing me blind. In reality, he had just signed his own solitary confinement papers. There, Eleanor said, waving her manicured hand toward the arched doorway. You have exactly what you wanted. Now leave. And do not even think about coming back to beg when you realize you cannot afford basic rent. I stood up slowly, keeping my head bowed, playing the role of the defeated, broken woman to the bitter end. I did not look at Blair, and I did not look at Carter. I walked heavily out of the dining room, my footsteps echoing softly through the marble foyer. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the tragic facade instantly vanished. I stood in the deep shadows of the massive stone porch, and I straightened my spine. I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks, a cold, genuine smile spreading across my face. I had done it. I was completely free and legally clean. When the federal agents raided that firm, they would find Carter standing entirely alone holding the bag for hundreds of millions in stolen offshore funds. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my practical sedan. The intense adrenaline that had sustained me through the digital heist in the parking garage, the hostile confrontation, and the masterful theatrical performance was rapidly beginning to fade, leaving a profound hollow exhaustion in its wake. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the cold steering wheel. I just needed to get home, upload the decoded ledgers to a secure server, and anonymously tip the authorities. I started the engine and pulled out onto the quiet, dark suburban street. But as I accelerated, an intense, unnatural pressure suddenly seized my lower back. I gasped, my grip tightening painfully on the leather wheel. I tried to breathe through it, assuming it was just a severe cramp from the overwhelming stress of the evening. But seconds later, a sharp, blinding pain ripped through my abdomen, radiating downward with terrifying intensity. It was completely unlike the normal discomforts of my pregnancy. It was a vicious, tearing agony that stole the breath straight from my lungs. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car harshly onto the rough shoulder of the dark road. The pain hit again, much harder this time, causing my vision to blur with bright, flashing white spots. I doubled over the steering wheel, clutching my swollen stomach. I was only 8 months along. It was entirely too early. But as another agonizing wave crashed over my body, sheer panic completely flooded my system. The intense, relentless stress of the betrayal, the digital espionage, and the emotional warfare had pushed my body past its absolute physical limit. I was going into premature labor alone in the dark, miles from any help. The dashboard clock glared back at me with bright digital numbers piercing the darkness. 2 in the morning. Another crushing wave of pain radiated through my lower back, forcing a sharp cry from my lips. The dark, deserted stretch of road offered absolutely no sanctuary. I reached blindly for my phone sitting in the passenger seat, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely unlock the screen. I tried to dial Jamal, but the call failed. He had warned me he was going completely dark, setting up his own extraction from Nicole, and the encrypted burner network was not meant for emergency medical dispatches. I was entirely on my own. I shifted the transmission back into drive, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted the distinct metallic tang of blood. Every pothole, every slight dip in the asphalt sent fresh, white-hot agony tearing through my abdomen. I gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, focusing entirely on the yellow lines illuminating under my headlights. In a moment of pure, primal desperation, a desperate reflex born from 4 years of marriage, I hit the voice command button on the console. Call Carter. I commanded, my voice rough and breathless. The system dialed. The line rang exactly once before the automated carrier message kicked in, sending me straight to his voicemail. He had blocked my number. He had turned his phone off or actively routed my emergency call into the digital void. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I swerved into the glowing red emergency bay of the local medical center, throwing the vehicle into park and leaving the engine running. I stumbled out of the driver's side door, leaning heavily against the metal frame. Within seconds, automatic doors slid open, and a pair of nurses rushed out with a wheelchair, catching me just as my knees buckled. The frantic transition from the freezing night air to the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital ward was a dizzying blur. They wheeled me into an isolated triage room, transferring me onto a stark white bed with practiced efficiency. Cold gel was slathered across my swollen belly, and thick elastic bands were strapped tightly around my waist, securing the fetal monitors in place. The rapid, rhythmic thumping of my son's heartbeat suddenly filled the quiet room, echoing off the blank institutional walls. The sound was incredibly strong, a rapid drumbeat of pure life that anchored my spiraling panic. The nurses drew blood, adjusted my IV, and quietly slipped out to page the on-call obstetrician, leaving me completely alone in the chilling silence of the examination room. The physical pain began to ebb, slightly replaced by a dull, heavy throbbing. I lay there, trapped beneath the monitors, staring at the blank ceiling. The isolation was profound. To stop my mind from racing toward worst-case scenarios, I reached over with my unhooked arm and grabbed my phone from the small plastic tray. I opened a social media application, mindlessly seeking any sort of distraction. As the feed refreshed, a live video notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was Blair. I tapped the glowing icon. The screen filled with high-definition footage broadcasting live to her curated list of followers. Blair was standing in the center of an expansive cavernous foyer. A sweeping dual staircase of wrought iron and white marble framed the background, while massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. She was wearing a sleek silk slip dress, entirely unbothered by the late hour, holding a delicate crystal flute of expensive champagne. Carter stepped into the frame wearing the same tailored suit he had worn at the dining room table just hours ago. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, pulling her against his chest. They looked incredibly triumphant, a picture-perfect display of affluent victory. "To our brand-new dream mansion," Blair announced, her voice echoing in the empty, opulent space, "and to our absolutely perfect future without any dead weight dragging us down." Carter leaned in and kissed her, his face glowing with the arrogance of a man who believed he had just legally stolen millions of dollars and successfully discarded his boring, inconvenient wife. He raised his own glass to the camera, taking a long, celebratory sip. They were toasting to the multi-million-dollar ghost property they had just purchased with laundered federal funds. They were drinking champagne in a stolen palace at 2 a.m, while I lay strapped to medical equipment in a sterile, lonely hospital room, terrified that my son was about to be born prematurely. The heavy wooden door of my room swung open, breaking me away from the sickening live stream. A tall, gray-haired doctor walked in, reviewing a digital chart on a tablet. He moved to the side of the bed, checking the readout from the fetal monitor and inspecting the paper tape spooling from the machine. "You are going to be fine, Riley," he stated, his voice calm and authoritative. "The baby is not in distress. What you are experiencing is a severe stress-induced false alarm. These are highly intensified Braxton Hicks contractions bordering on an irritable uterus." I let out a long, shaky breath, letting my head fall back against the thin hospital pillow. But the doctor did not smile. His expression remained incredibly stern. However, he continued, lowering the tablet and looking me directly in the eyes. "You are hovering on the absolute brink of actual premature labor. The physical indicators are all elevated. Your blood pressure is dangerously high and your cortisol levels are off the charts. I do not know what kind of trauma or emotional upheaval you endured tonight, but it has to stop immediately. If your stress levels do not drop to 0 right now, you will deliver this baby tonight, and his lungs are not fully developed. You must eliminate whatever is causing this extreme stress, or you are going to put your child in very real danger." I absorbed his clinical warning in absolute silence. "Eliminate the stress immediately." The doctor patted my hand, promising to send a nurse with discharge papers and a prescription for medical-grade relaxants before stepping back out into the busy corridor. I lay in the quiet room, the rhythmic heartbeat of my son continuing its steady, reassuring march. I looked back down at the darkened screen of my phone, where just minutes ago my husband had been celebrating my utter defeat. The raw vulnerability that had seized me in the car completely evaporated. The primal fear of losing my child vanished, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. The sheer, monumental cruelty of lying alone in a hospital bed, ignoring my medical emergency, while he flaunted his stolen wealth with his pregnant mistress, caused a profound physical shift inside me. The last remaining shreds of empathy, the lingering fragments of the woman who had once loved Carter, completely calcified. My heart hardened into a block of solid, impenetrable ice. I was not just going to divorce him and hand over evidence to the federal authorities. I was going to systematically dismantle his life. I was going to ensure that he lost absolutely everything, and I was going to execute it with the same cold, calculating precision he had used to discard me. I unplugged my phone from the wall charger, sitting up in the hospital bed with perfect mechanical posture. The contraction was over and the real work was about to begin. I pulled my heavy black tote bag from the sterile plastic chair beside my hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights mounted in the ceiling cast a stark, unforgiving glare across the small room, illuminating the reality of my surroundings. My fingers bypassed my personal belongings and closed around the cool metal chassis of my secured laptop. I hoisted it onto my lap, resting it carefully against the thin cotton blanket that covered my legs, mindful of the fetal monitors still strapped tightly around my swollen abdomen. The raw, agonizing grief that had threatened to consume me just an hour ago was entirely gone. It had evaporated in the heat of Carter's broadcasted betrayal. There were no tears left to cry, no desperate hopes clinging to a marriage that had been nothing more than an elaborate, suffocating illusion. In their place, a profound, chilling clarity had taken root. I felt nothing but cold, calculated justice. It was a terrifyingly calm sensation, a methodical detachment that sharpened my senses and slowed my pulse to a steady rhythmic beat. I booted up the machine, bypassing the standard operating system to load the encrypted partition I used for high-level forensic investigations. I engaged the secure mobile hotspot routing my connection through a cascading series of virtual private networks. My digital footprint needed to be completely untraceable, a ghost moving seamlessly through the federal networks. I opened two separate highly secure browser windows. In the first, I navigated directly to the official portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission, specifically the Office of the Whistleblower. In the second, I accessed the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division reporting terminal. This was the point of no return. I was not filing a simple human resources complaint or seeking civil mediation. I was initiating a massive federal strike that would completely level a multi-million-dollar financial empire. I opened the master folder containing the decoded data. Meticulously, with the precision of a surgeon operating on a critical patient, I began the upload sequence. I dragged and dropped the decrypted ledgers into the SEC's secure intake forms. These files were the indisputable lifeblood of the operation, clearly displaying the illegal siphoning of capital from dozens of high-net-worth retirement portfolios. I attached the internal network logs, providing undeniable proof of the late-night data transfers and offshore routing protocols that intentionally bypassed the wealth management firm's compliance software. Next, I turned my attention to the FBI portal. Here, I uploaded the heavily guarded dummy corporation deeds I had uncovered. I meticulously linked every single shell company to Blair's boutique real estate firm, providing the exact state registry documents that proved her direct involvement. The data told a flawless, horrifying story. I mapped out the exact trail of the stolen retirement funds, charting the money as it flowed from innocent clients into Carter's control, washed through the proxy servers in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands, and finally landed stateside to be aggressively laundered through Blair's high-end property acquisitions. With the massive data packets attached, I moved on to the formal narrative submission. The government agencies required a clear, concise roadmap to navigate the dense financial data, and I provided them with a masterpiece of forensic accounting. I drafted the whistleblower report with ruthless objectivity. I explicitly named Carter as the sole architect and primary beneficiary of the Ponzi scheme, detailing how he used his position of trust to mask his unauthorized withdrawals. I broke down his specific methodologies, the dummy accounts, and the fake return statements he generated to keep his clients docile and completely unaware of the theft. Then I turned the spotlight on his mistress. I formally named Blair as the primary money laundering accomplice. I detailed how she weaponized her luxury real estate license, acting as the crucial mechanism to legitimize the stolen cash. I provided a chronological list of the multi-million-dollar ghost properties she had purchased over the last 18 months, including the opulent mansion they were currently drinking champagne inside. I left absolutely no room for ambiguity or plausible deniability. I built an ironclad cage of evidence around them, locking the door and throwing away the key. I took one final steadying breath, my eyes scanning the completed forms. I reached out and pressed the submission button on both portals simultaneously. The progress bars filled rapidly, transitioning from blue to a solid, definitive green. The confirmation screens flashed before me, generating official federal tracking numbers. The payload was delivered. The fuse was lit. Just as the federal confirmation emails arrived in my encrypted inbox, a separate notification chimed loudly in the quiet hospital room. I minimized the browser windows and opened the new message. It was marked with high importance, sent directly from the senior partner of the aggressive corporate law firm representing Carter. I read the text, my eyes scanning the harsh, threatening legal jargon. It was a formal, ruthless ultimatum. The email stated that the preliminary paperwork I had signed at the dining room table earlier that evening was legally insufficient without an official notary and formal presentation on the corporate record. The attorney demanded that I appear in person at their downtown high-rise offices at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning to officially execute the final binding divorce decrees and notarize the absolute relinquishment of assets and indemnification agreements. The final paragraph was a blatant threat drafted to inspire absolute panic. If I failed to appear, or if I attempted to contest the terms we had supposedly agreed upon, Carter's legal team would immediately file motions to completely drain my remaining personal finances. They promised to subject me to a drawn-out, bankrupting legal war that would leave me entirely destitute, drowning in endless court fees, and totally unfit to raise my child. They were banking on my exhaustion, my fear, and my desperate desire to escape the family. I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer audacity of their threat echoing in the sterile hospital silence. They truly believed they had pushed me into a corner, completely unaware that the floor beneath their feet had already vanished. I did not feel a single ounce of intimidation. Instead, a dark, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. I closed the laptop with a satisfying click, slipping it securely back into my heavy tote bag. I rested my hand gently on my stomach, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of my son's movements. The physical contractions had completely subsided, my body stabilizing now that the toxic weight of my marriage had been permanently eradicated from my mind. I lay back against the thin pillows, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. I would not cower. I would not run. I would walk directly into their sleek downtown boardroom tomorrow morning and look the devil right in the eye, knowing exactly what was coming for him. The morning sun glared off the towering glass facades of the downtown financial district, casting sharp, angular shadows across the busy pavement. I stepped out of my practical sedan and smoothed the front of my dark maternity dress, feeling the solid, heavy weight of my unborn son pressing against my pelvis. My posture was completely rigid, my mind operating with the clinical detachment of a machine. I walked through the revolving doors of the monolithic skyscraper that housed Carter's elite legal representation, bypassing the bustling lobby and stepping directly into the express elevator. The rapid ascent made my ears pop, but my heart rate remained incredibly steady. I stepped out onto the 50th floor, into a sprawling reception area dominated by dark mahogany and brushed steel. A severe receptionist wearing a sleek headset nodded sharply and escorted me down a long, silent corridor designed entirely to intimidate. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to a massive glass-walled conference room that seemingly floated above the city skyline. I walked in my heavy, pregnant belly, crossing the threshold first, a physical, unavoidable reminder of everything Carter was recklessly discarding. The room was freezing, the air conditioning cranked high enough to preserve a corpse. Sitting on the opposite side of a sprawling 20-foot marble table was the welcoming committee. Carter sat dead center, radiating a repulsive aura of absolute invincibility. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit, his posture relaxed and expansive, claiming as much space as possible. To his immediate right sat Blair. She was draped in a tailored cream-colored cashmere ensemble that screamed quiet wealth, her legs crossed elegantly beneath the table. She looked at me with eyes full of poisonous pity, a smug victor admiring her conquered territory. To Carter's left sat a man I recognized from various insufferable corporate galas. Marcus Vance, a senior partner at the firm known specifically for his ruthless scorched earth tactics in high-asset divorce proceedings. He looked exactly like a shark smelling blood in the water. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down directly across from my husband, adjusting my posture until I was sitting perfectly straight. No one offered me a glass of water. No one asked how I was feeling after the traumatic events of the previous night. The lack of basic human decency was staggering, but completely expected. I placed my hands flat on the cold marble surface and waited. Vance did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He leaned forward, folding his hands together, his dark eyes locking onto mine with practiced corporate intimidation. "Let us get straight to the point, Riley," he stated, his voice booming in the acoustically perfect room. "You are here to execute the finalized version of the preliminary agreements you signed last night. My client has instructed me to be remarkably generous with the timeline, allowing you this swift resolution rather than dragging you through a punitive discovery process." He slid a massive bound document across the smooth table. It came to a stop just inches from my folded hands. The thick white paper represented the systematic erasure of my entire adult life. "We are formally executing a complete forfeiture of assets." Vance continued, his tone dripping with condescending authority. "You are officially waiving your rights to the primary marital residence in Fairfield and the vacation properties. You are relinquishing all claims to the joint savings accounts, the investment portfolios, and the offshore trusts. Furthermore, you are surrendering any and all equity stakes in Carter's wealth management firm. You will walk out of this room with the clothes on your back, the vehicle you drove here in, and a modest transitional stipend that will cover your medical expenses for the remainder of your pregnancy. That is the entirety of the settlement." Carter leaned back, interlacing his fingers behind his head, a wide, self-satisfied grin stretching across his face. He actually believed he was executing a masterful corporate coup. He thought he had bullied a weak middle-class accountant into complete submission. He was celebrating a flawless victory, completely blind to the federal crosshairs painted squarely on his chest. Vance tapped a manicured finger against the thick stack of paper. "If you refuse to sign this finalized document today, the offer is immediately rescinded. We will file emergency motions to freeze your personal checking accounts. We will drag you into a litigation process that will take years and cost millions in legal fees. You will be bankrupted before the baby is even born. The choice is entirely yours, but I highly recommend you take the exit ramp we are providing." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Carter and Vance stared at me, waiting for the inevitable tears, the begging, the desperate pleas for mercy. They waited for the emotional breakdown they had meticulously engineered. Instead, Blair shifted in her chair, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. She twirled it between her fingers for a moment before flicking her wrist. The heavy metal pen slid across the polished marble table, spinning end over end, until it hit the edge of the legal packet right in front of me. "Just sign it, Riley," Blair purred, her voice laced with venomous satisfaction. "Do not make this any harder than it already is. Carter has a massive portfolio to manage, and we have a new home to furnish. You are taking up valuable time." I looked down at the silver pen and then up at the three of them. I did not cry. I did not flinch. My pulse did not elevate a single beat. The panic from last night was entirely gone, replaced by the icy calm of a woman holding a royal flush. I rested my forearms on the table, clasping my hands together, and looked directly into Carter's arrogant blue eyes. "I will sign your papers, Carter," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute total composure. "I will sign away the house. I will sign away the savings. I will forfeit the business equity right here and right now. I will give you the seamless, completely uncontested divorce you are so desperate for." I watched a flicker of surprise flash across Carter's face, instantly replaced by a greedy, eager anticipation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, waiting for me to pick up the pen. But I did not reach for the silver medal. Instead, I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room grew thick and uncomfortable. "I will sign immediately," I repeated, my tone dropping to a sharp, lethal register. "But I require one specific, non-negotiable modification to this contract before I put my ink on that paper." Vance's dark eyes narrowed into thin, dangerous slits, his silver pen pausing mid-air. Carter simply rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh that echoed off the pristine glass walls. I ignored their posturing, keeping my posture rigid and my voice utterly devoid of emotion, as I dictated the exact legal phrasing I had spent months drafting in the shadows. I want a bulletproof, ironclad indemnification clause inserted directly into the primary decree I stated, enunciating every single syllable with absolute precision. The language must explicitly state that Riley is released and held 100% harmless from any civil, criminal, tax, and financial liabilities tied to Carter's assets, businesses, and properties retroactively and in perpetuity. For a fraction of a second, the room was dead silent. Then Carter threw his head back and erupted into genuine booming laughter. He laughed so hard he actually had to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. Blair joined in with a high-pitched melodic giggle that grated against my eardrums. They looked at me as if I had just demanded ownership of the moon. "You are unbelievable," Carter wheezed, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You are walking away from a massive fortune from prime real estate and liquid assets, and your only concern is making sure you are not on the hook for a few corporate credit cards. This is exactly why you will always be a drab middle-class accountant, Riley. You are utterly terrified of leverage. You see a thriving corporate empire and you just see potential debt. You have absolutely no stomach for the realities of high finance." Blair leaned forward, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hand. "It is actually quite sad," she mocked, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "She is so paranoid about your minor business expenses, she is willing to bankrupt herself just to run away. Let her have her silly little safety blanket, Carter. It is the least we can do for her." Vance, however, did not laugh. The seasoned attorney frowned his predatory instincts, sensing something slightly off in my specific comprehensive demand for criminal and tax immunity. He leaned toward his client, lowering his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper. "Carter, I strongly advise against rushing this. Broad retroactive criminal indemnification is highly unusual in a standard dissolution. We need to send this to the risk management team for a deeper review before we alter the core agreement." But Carter was completely blinded by his own towering arrogance and the intoxicating promise of undisputed wealth. He looked at the massive stack of forfeiture documents resting in front of me, which were papers that would legally hand him sole ownership of the offshore accounts and the dummy corporations holding the stolen retirement funds. He was absolutely terrified that if he delayed the signing, I might suddenly wake up, hire my own aggressive counsel, and demand a thorough audit of his holdings. In his rush to secure his fraudulent wealth before the divorce dragged out and exposed his fragile Ponzi scheme to the brutal light of the discovery process, he completely ignored his lawyer. "Do not be ridiculous," Marcus Carter snapped, waving off his senior attorney with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "She is just a paranoid bean counter terrified of a minor tax audit. I am not letting hundreds of millions of dollars sit in legal limbo while your risk team debates boilerplate liability clauses for a week. Type up her little paranoid addendum right now. Get the notary in here. We are finishing this today." Vance tightened his jaw, clearly displeased with being overruled, but he ultimately yielded to the man paying his exorbitant retainer. He opened his sleek laptop and rapidly keyed in the exact verbiage I had demanded. Within minutes, the heavy oak door of the conference room opened, and a firm paralegal entered, accompanied by an official notary public carrying a heavy brass seal. The printer in the corner hummed to life, spitting out the freshly amended pages. Vance retrieved the warm paper and slid it across the mahogany table. The ironclad indemnification clause was printed clearly on page 42, standing as a towering, impenetrable fortress between me and the impending federal fallout. Carter snatched the silver fountain pen from the table and aggressively slashed his signature across the bottom of the page, cementing his absolute ownership of a fraudulent empire and claiming sole undisputed responsibility for every single federal crime attached to it. He slid the packet toward me, a sneer of absolute triumph plastered across his handsome, deceitful face. I picked up the pen. My hand was incredibly steady. I calmly signed my name in fluid dark ink, legally severing myself from Carter, from his toxic family, and from the massive criminal enterprise he had built. The notary stepped forward, checking our identifications before pressing the heavy brass stamp onto the paper. The sharp mechanical crunch of the seal echoed through the silent room. It was done. The document was officially notarized. It is legally binding and completely irreversible. I was permanently and financially insulated. I carefully placed the pen back onto the polished mahogany. I packed my identification back into my black tote bag and hoisted it onto my shoulder. Pushing myself up from the heavy leather chair, I stood up tall, the full weight of my pregnant belly, serving as a testament to the future I had just secured for my son. I looked directly at the smirking couple. They were practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, already whispering to each other about their stolen millions and their lavish future. I let a cold, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Keep your assets," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the freezing glass room. "You are going to need them." I did not wait to see the confusion register on their faces. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, my footsteps steady and purposeful on the hardwood floors. I navigated the long, silent corridor, passing the severe receptionist without a single glance. I stepped into the express elevator, watching the doors slide shut, sealing away the most toxic chapter of my entire life. The rapid descent to the ground floor felt incredibly liberating. I stepped out into the sprawling sunlit lobby of the financial high-rise, the bustling noise of the morning commute washing over me. I took a deep, cleansing breath, ready to walk out into the city and finally breathe free air. But as I took my third step toward the revolving glass doors, a sudden intense physical sensation halted me dead in my tracks. It was entirely different from the stress-induced pain of the previous night. There was a distinct, deep pop in my lower abdomen, followed instantly by a warm, heavy rush of fluid cascading down my legs and pooling onto the polished granite floor of the lobby. I gasped, gripping the edge of a nearby security desk, as a genuine earth-shattering contraction ripped through my body with breathtaking ferocity. The sterile hospital warnings from the night before rushed back to my mind. The false alarm was completely over. As I stepped out into the lobby, her water breaks. Real labor has begun. The polished granite floor of the lobby seemed to tilt violently beneath my feet. A uniformed security guard rushed toward me, his radio already unclipped, shouting urgently for someone to call an ambulance. I gripped the edge of the sleek reception desk, my knuckles turning stark white as a secondary wave of agonizing pressure radiated through my lower spine. Through the blinding haze of sudden pain, I fumbled for my phone with a trembling hand, bypassing emergency services to dial the only person I could completely trust. Jamal, my brilliant colleague and the loyal confidant who had spent countless nights helping me decode the illicit ledgers, answered on the first ring. I could barely choke out the name of the nearest hospital and my current location before the phone slipped from my sweaty grasp and clattered against the stone floor. The transition from the corporate high-rise to the stark, glaring lights of the emergency maternity ward was a chaotic, terrifying blur of wailing sirens and shouted medical jargon. I was immediately strapped onto a gurney, a tangle of wires and fetal monitors rapidly taped to my stomach. The cold clinical detachment that had served me so well in the boardroom completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, visceral agony that consumed my entire reality. This was a high-risk delivery, weeks ahead of schedule, and the machines beside my bed beeped with an urgent, erratic rhythm that signaled distress. The heavy door to my delivery suite burst open, and Jamal rushed in, his usually immaculate suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. He gripped my hand tightly, his presence a sudden stabilizing anchor in the center of the storm. He wiped the cold sweat from my forehead with a damp cloth, speaking in low, steady tones, reminding me to breathe, reminding me that the hardest part of my war was already over. I just had to survive this final physical battle. Miles away from the sterile scent of iodine and bleach, the air was thick with the aroma of expensive cologne, imported florals, and roasted truffles. Carter and Blair were making their grand, triumphant debut in the sprawling stolen estate, hosting a housewarming gala that rivaled a royal coronation. The massive circular driveway was packed end to end with a fleet of luxury vehicles, and a string quartet played lively, upbeat melodies on the manicured front lawn. Inside the cavernous foyer, towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of high-net-worth clients, These were the very same individuals whose heavily guarded retirement funds were currently paying for the beluga caviar and vintage champagne circulating on silver trays. Carter stood near the center of the grand sweeping staircase, a bespoke velvet tuxedo hugging his frame, looking every inch the untouchable master of the universe. Blair clung tightly to his arm, glittering in a diamond-encrusted silk gown, her smile bright and utterly hollow as she accepted endless compliments on the opulent decor she had purchased with laundered cash. Another brutal, unrelenting contraction ripped through my abdomen, tearing a ragged, breathless scream from my throat. I crushed Jamal's hand. My teeth gritted so hard my jaw ached with the effort. The medical team surrounded the bed, their faces tight with serious concern as they monitored the baby's dangerously fluctuating heart rate. The senior obstetrician barked rapid orders to the attending nurses, demanding supplemental oxygen and prepping a crash cart just in case my blood pressure plummeted any further. Every single muscle in my body seized a fiery, all-consuming pressure that demanded absolutely everything I had left to give. Jamal leaned in close, his voice a fierce, unyielding command cutting directly through the chaos of the room. He told me to focus on the future, to think about the safe, untainted, and completely free life I had just secured for my son. I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling every ounce of my remaining strength, drawing on every ounce of the rage and betrayal I had endured over the past year and pushing it all outward. At the mansion, the bass of the upbeat music faded as Carter tapped a crystal spoon against his champagne flute. The sharp, clear, ringing sound brought the lavish, crowded party to a quiet, attentive halt. He raised his glass high, flashing his trademark predatory smile, scanning the sea of wealthy, oblivious investors looking up at him with pure admiration. He projected the ultimate flawless image of success, launching into a deeply charismatic, boastful speech about vision, relentless dedication, and the grueling sacrifices required to become a true self-made man. He brazenly spoke of building empires on a foundation of absolute trust, gesturing proudly to the vaulted hand-painted ceilings of the fraudulent property. He pulled Blair close against his side, kissing her cheek for the cameras of the hired event photographers, declaring his absolute certainty in their bright, untouchable future together. He drank the champagne, soaking in the thunderous, echoing applause, completely intoxicated by his own brilliant, perfectly orchestrated illusion. The contrast could not be more absolute, more starkly defined. Carter stood on a towering pedestal of lies celebrating a dying empire while I lay in a harsh hospital bed fighting a desperate bloody war for truth and new life. The doctor shouted over the din of the monitors telling me this was the final critical push. Jamal braced my shoulders, his unwavering encouragement echoing in my ears, anchoring me to the earth. I drew in a ragged, desperate breath, my lungs burning with exhaustion, and pushed with a ferocity that shook me to my absolute core. The blinding pain peaked, cresting into an overwhelming crescendo of sheer human endurance and raw maternal willpower. The room seemed to hold its breath for one terrifying, agonizingly silent second. Then, piercing clearly through the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the machines and the heavy, sterile air of the delivery room, a loud, vibrant, healthy cry finally erupted. The squalling, slippery weight of my son was placed gently onto my bare chest. The harsh, clinical environment of the delivery room instantly melted away, replaced by the overwhelming primal heat of his small body against mine. I wrapped my trembling arms around him, feeling the rapid, fragile flutter of his tiny heartbeat against my skin. He was absolutely perfect. He possessed 10 tiny toes, 10 grasping fingers, and a fierce set of lungs that announced his arrival to the world with undeniable authority. The sheer physical exhaustion radiating through my bones was completely eclipsed by an intoxicating, ferocious wave of maternal love. I kissed the top of his damp head, inhaling the sweet scent of new life. Jamal stood over us, a wide, genuine grin breaking across his exhausted features. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, sharing a silent, profound look of absolute victory. We had done it. My son was safe, untouched by the toxic debris of the empire I had just systematically dismantled. At that exact second, a harsh, aggressive buzzing shattered the quiet intimacy of our moment. Jamal's phone vibrated violently against the edge of the metal bedside table, the device practically dancing across the steel surface. He picked it up, his tired eyes darting rapidly across a barrage of incoming high-priority push notifications. His jaw dropped slightly before a sharp predatory smile replaced his initial shock. He quickly swiped across the glass, pulling up a highly encrypted application we had secretly installed months ago. He tilted the glowing screen toward me, making sure I had a clear, unobstructed view of the high-definition live security feed transmitting directly from Carter's heavily guarded estate. The digital footage played out like a perfectly orchestrated cinematic climax. A convoy of matte black tactical vans roared up the sweeping circular driveway, their heavy tires ruthlessly tearing through the immaculate imported turf and crushing the manicured flower beds. The lively string quartets scattered in absolute terror, dropping their expensive instruments as dozens of federal agents clad in heavy Kevlar vests and tactical gear swarmed the property with military precision. The blaring, obnoxious dance music inside the mansion was violently cut off, leaving a jarring, heavy silence that was instantly filled by the panicked, high-pitched shrieks of the local elite. The heavy custom mahogany front doors were kicked inward, with a deafening crack splintering off their expensive brass hinges as the FBI aggressively breached the sprawling foyer. Through the crisp lens of the hidden security camera, I watched Carter's carefully constructed universe completely implode. The arrogant, untouchable master of the universe froze on the grand staircase, his crystal champagne flute slipping from his hand and shattering into 1,000 sparkling pieces on the pristine marble floor. Before he could even formulate a single coherent sentence or deploy his usual slick corporate charm, 2 burly federal agents tackled him. They shoved him roughly against a towering decorative marble pillar, twisting his arms violently behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed clearly over the chaotic audio feed. He was pinned there, his face smashed against the cold stone, humiliated and completely neutralized directly in front of the very high net worth clients he had spent the entire evening defrauding. The investors watched in sheer, unadulterated horror, backing away slowly as the grand illusion of their financial security evaporated before their extremely wealthy eyes. Across the cavernous foyer, Blair was descending into absolute shrieking hysteria. She flailed wildly, her perfectly styled hair flying in every direction as female agents cornered her against a velvet-upholstered wall. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to speak to her lawyers, screaming about her inherent rights and her absolute innocence. The federal agents ignored her tantrums entirely. They systematically seized her diamond-encrusted handbag, ripping the expensive tennis bracelets from her wrists and dropping the illicitly funded items directly into clear plastic evidence boxes. A stern senior agent stepped squarely into her line of sight, aggressively reading her the Miranda rights. Through the audio feed, the commanding words rang out with damning clarity, citing her formal immediate arrest for widespread wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and aggressive multi-million-dollar money laundering. The color completely drained from her face as the heavy, crushing reality of federal prison finally crashed down upon her delicate shoulders. I adjusted my protective grip on my sleeping son, my eyes glued to the digital screen. Carter was roughly dragged away from the decorative pillar frog, marched through the crowded, chaotic lobby by a team of unsmiling agents. His bespoke velvet tuxedo was wrinkled and torn, his face pale and twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. The agents shoved his head down, forcing him into the cramped, unforgiving back seat of a flashing squad car waiting aggressively on the ruined front lawn. The brilliant red and blue emergency lights washed over his features, highlighting the sheer absolute terror of a man who had finally hit a permanent dead end. The live feed cut out, returning the phone screen to a blank, dark mirror. I handed the device back to Jamal, leaning deep into the thin hospital pillows. A profound, settling peace washed over my entire being. The toxic rot had been completely excised from our lives. Hours later, in the cold, unforgiving concrete processing area of the downtown federal precinct, Carter was systematically stripped of his expensive leather belt, his silk shoelaces, and his remaining shreds of dignity. A bored, cynical desk sergeant pointed to a greasy, battered wall phone mounted at the far end of the bleak holding cell corridor. He told my soon-to-be ex-husband he had exactly 3 minutes to use his single legally mandated phone call. Carter grabbed the heavy plastic receiver with trembling, sweaty hands. He did not dial his ruthless defense attorney. He did not dial Blair, who was currently being processed and strip-searched in a separate secure facility. Desperate, terrified, and completely out of viable options, he punched in a familiar 10-digit number. The harsh, aggressive vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet serenity of my hospital recovery room. Jamal, who had been gently rocking his new godson by the window, glanced down at the glowing screen resting on my bedside table. He raised an eyebrow, noting the automated caller ID flashing an unknown local number originating from the downtown precinct. I nodded, passing my sleeping baby safely into Jamal's protective arms. Before reaching out to accept the call, a robotic, pre-recorded voice immediately announced that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Detention Center. I pressed the corresponding key to accept the charges, leaning back against the sterile white pillows, letting the silence stretch as I waited for the inevitable performance to begin. The moment the line clicked open, the heavy silence was violently punctured by a wet, ragged, and entirely pathetic sob. It was a sound so completely devoid of the polished, untouchable bravado Carter had wielded just hours ago in that freezing conference room that it was almost unrecognizable. He was hyperventilating, his breath catching in panicked, desperate gasps that echoed clearly through the receiver. The sleek corporate titan had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, broken shell of a man trapped within the bleak, unforgiving walls of a concrete holding cell. I listened to the raw, unfiltered sound of his weeping, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no lingering affection, and no sudden urge to comfort him. There was only the cold, deeply satisfying realization that the trap had flawlessly snapped shut. "Riley! Oh God! Riley, please!" He choked out his voice, cracking violently, as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. "You have to help me. They raided the house. They took everything. It is a mistake, a massive, unbelievable misunderstanding." He rambled frantically, the words tripping over each other in his sheer desperation to rewrite reality. He claimed he had been completely set up, swearing that rogue business partners had executed unauthorized offshore trades entirely behind his back. He insisted that the complex shell corporations in Cyprus were merely aggressive tax strategies that had been wildly misconstrued by overzealous, headline-hungry federal agents. He was spinning a frantic, disjointed web of absolute delusion, throwing every possible excuse at the wall to see what would stick, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the exact architect who had handed the FBI the meticulous blueprints to his destruction. When his desperate excuses failed to elicit a single sound of sympathy from my end of the line, he shifted tactics, transitioning into frantic, demanding pleas. "You understand this financial data better than anyone, Riley," he begged, his voice taking on a manic, feverish edge. "You are the best forensic accountant I know. You can trace the ledgers. You can prove to the feds that the money was routed legally. You just need to look at the raw data and explain it to them in layman's terms. They will listen to you. If you just come down here right now, if you just sit down and talk to Vance, we can untangle this whole ridiculous mess." He was actively begging the very woman who had dismantled his empire to save him from the rubble, utterly blind to the profound irony of asking me to clean up the crime scene I had deliberately exposed to the authorities. Then, without taking a single breath, he threw his glamorous mistress directly under the approaching federal bus. The undying loyalty he had so proudly proclaimed just a few hours prior dissolved instantly under the terrifying threat of a lengthy federal prison sentence. "It was Blair," he hissed, his tone suddenly turning sharp and venomous, echoing off the cinder-block walls of his cell. "She was the one laundering the cash through her boutique real estate firm. She pushed me into managing those illegal high-risk portfolios so she could fund her lifestyle. I will testify against her, Riley. I will gladly leave her to rot in a federal penitentiary. I do not care about her. She meant absolutely nothing to me. It was a stupid, reckless, meaningless mistake, and I am so entirely, incredibly sorry." He offered up his partner in crime without a second of hesitation, proving exactly how hollow and self-serving his devotion had always been. Having sacrificed Blair to save his own skin, Carter pivoted to his final, most manipulative tactic, emotional warfare. He deliberately lowered his voice, injecting a manufactured trembling sincerity into his tone, as he tried to pluck at strings that no longer existed. "I just want to come home," he wept softly, attempting to sound like a wrongfully accused family man. "I want to come home to you, Riley, to our house, to our marriage. Is the baby here? Did you have our son? Please, Riley, I want to be a father. I want to fix this and be the man you deserve. We can start over completely fresh. Just you, me, and our boy. Remember your vows, Riley, for better or for worse. You would not let the father of your child go to prison for something he did not do. Please do not abandon me here in the dark. You are my wife. I need you." He banked everything on the illusion of the submissive, accommodating, terrified woman he had bullied and gaslit for years. He truly believed, even sitting in federal custody, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, that a few tears and the strategic mention of our newborn son would instantly erase months of severe psychological warfare, public humiliation, and calculated financial abuse. He expected me to cave to his demands, to rush downtown to his defense, and to sacrifice my hard-won peace to rescue him from his own insatiable greed. I remained completely silent, letting the absolute weight of his pathetic, weeping desperation fill the line. I listened as the silence stretched out and his breathing grew increasingly frantic. "Riley, say something," he demanded, a brief, pathetic flash of his old temper attempting to surface before being swallowed again by a fresh wave of sobbing. "You have to call Vance. Tell him you will testify on my behalf. Tell him you will secure the bail. Please, Riley, they are taking my shoelaces. They are taking my belt. I cannot stay in this cage." He was entirely broken, a fragile house of cards that had collapsed under the slightest gust of truth. I adjusted my sleeping son in my arms, pulling the soft hospital swaddle tighter around his tiny, perfect shoulders. The rhythmic, soothing hum of the neonatal monitors provided a stark, beautiful contrast to the desperate, hyperventilating gasps bleeding through the phone's speaker. Jamal stood silently by the window, watching me with absolute respect as I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile hospital air fill my lungs. My voice, when I finally broke the silence, was entirely devoid of pity, anger, or malice. It was the clinical, absolute tone of an executioner delivering a final, unyielding verdict. "There is no misunderstanding, Carter," I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable. I was the one who sent the files to the FBI. The reaction on the other end of the line was absolute, suffocating silence. The frantic weeping ceased instantly, replaced by a sharp, strangled intake of air. I did not wait for his denial or his shock to fully register. I systematically walked him through the precise anatomy of his destruction. I explained exactly how easy it had been once I knew where to look to completely dismantle his amateur financial labyrinth. I detailed the countless late nights spent cross-referencing the IP addresses of his dummy corporations in Cyprus with the encrypted emails routed through his private servers. I calmly recited the exact names of the phantom board members he had fabricated, the specific shell companies he used to bleed his clients dry, and the offshore holding accounts he erroneously thought were completely invisible to domestic authorities. I mapped it all out, Carter. I told him, keeping my volume low so as not to disturb my sleeping baby. Every fraudulent wire transfer, every doctored quarterly report, every single dime you and Blair laundered through that boutique real estate firm. I compiled a comprehensive, indisputable digital footprint of your entire Ponzi scheme and handed it directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a silver platter. They have absolutely everything: the ledgers, the routing numbers, the hidden domestic assets. There is no defense strategy that can save you because I provided them with the master key to your entire criminal enterprise. A low, guttural noise rumbled through the receiver, a sound of profound, unadulterated horror. But before he could interrupt, I delivered the final fatal blow. "And those divorce papers you eagerly rushed to sign yesterday afternoon?" I asked rhetorically. "The ones you mocked me for demanding that ironclad indemnification clause was not a paranoid safety blanket against minor corporate credit card debt. It was a legally binding retroactive shield designed explicitly, to insulate me and my son from the impending federal fallout. By signing that document, you legally claimed sole undisputed ownership of every single fraudulent asset, and you absorbed 100% of the criminal, civil, and financial liabilities attached to them. You guaranteed that the federal government cannot touch a single cent of my legitimate savings or my son's future. You are going to be ordered to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in federal restitution, and you are going to carry that insurmountable, crushing debt entirely alone. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and violent. The arrogant facade did not just shatter, it was completely atomized. Carter unleashed a sound that was less human and more akin to a cornered, wounded animal. He began screaming a torrential, incoherent flood of vicious curses, threats, and agonized wails. He slammed his fists against the cinder-block walls of his holding cell, the heavy, sickening thuds echoing clearly over the phone line. He shrieked my name, cursing the day we met, threatening to ruin me, promising a vengeance he no longer had the power or the resources to execute. His voice tore into a ragged, desperate screech, the sound of a narcissist finally realizing he was completely, utterly powerless. I listened to his manic breakdown for 3 seconds, feeling nothing but a profound, cleansing sense of absolute closure. He was no longer a threat. He was just a pathetic, noisy echo of a nightmare I had already survived. I did not offer a closing remark or a dramatic farewell. I simply tapped the red icon on the glowing screen. The line went dead, severing my connection to Carter permanently. I handed the phone back to Jamal, who offered a quiet nod of solidarity. I looked down at my son, tracing the soft curve of his cheek with my thumb, knowing that his life would never be tainted by the man who had sired him. The devastating ripple effect of the raid extended far beyond the bleak walls of the downtown precinct, reaching the very enablers who had cultivated Carter's towering entitlement. Miles away, in an exclusive gated suburban enclave, Carter's parents were settling into their morning routine. His father, a man who had always proudly excused Carter's ruthless shortcuts as mere business savvy, sat in his leather armchair with a freshly brewed cup of imported coffee. His mother, who had perpetually treated me as an unworthy temporary fixture in her golden boy's life, was finalizing plans for a luxurious European cruise. Blissfully unaware of the spectacular implosion of their son's empire, Carter's father opened his sleek tablet to check his primary financial portfolios. He navigated to their private banking portal, intending to transfer funds to cover the deposit for his wife's extravagant vacation. He typed in his secure credentials, expecting to see the heavily padded retirement accounts that Carter had personally promised to manage and multiply. Instead, the screen refreshed to display a stark, glaring red banner across the top of the dashboard. The numbers beneath it were entirely zeroed out. Every single liquid asset, every long-term investment, every trust fund they had blindly entrusted to their son's fraudulent firm had vanished. Confused and mildly annoyed, he refreshed the page, assuming it was a simple server error. The red banner remained accompanied by a stark, formal digital notice citing a federal freeze mandate. A cold, creeping dread began to pool in his stomach. He frantically dialed the private direct line to his elite wealth manager, his fingers slipping on the glass screen. A pre-recorded message from the Department of Justice intercepted the call, coldly stating that the financial institution had been seized pending an active federal investigation into massive wire fraud and racketeering. The expensive coffee cup slipped from his trembling hands, spilling dark liquid across the pristine Persian rug. His wife rushed into the room, demanding to know what was wrong, but he could only stare blankly at the tablet. The brutal, inescapable truth crashed down upon them in an instant. Carter had not just stolen from faceless investors and wealthy strangers. In his insatiable, desperate need to maintain his fraudulent liquidity and project the illusion of staggering success, he had cannibalized his own family's wealth. Their entire life savings, their pristine credit, their comfortable, arrogant retirement was gone, seized by the United States government to pay for their son's monumental crimes. They were utterly ruined, left with absolutely nothing but the crushing realization that they had enabled the very monster who devoured them. Exactly 3 days later, The heavy steel doors of the federal detention center slammed shut behind Blair. The biting metropolitan wind whipped at her tangled hair, a stark physical contrast to the perfectly coiffed style she had sported at the ruined gala. She shivered in the oversized, wrinkled gray sweatsuit she had been handed, at processing her diamond-encrusted life completely stripped away in a matter of hours. She had barely managed to secure a bail bond, relying on a shady, exorbitant bondsman who had demanded the physical deed to her elderly mother's modest home as non-negotiable collateral. Stepping onto the bleak, concrete sidewalk, Blair faced a reality that resembled a suffocating waking nightmare. The federal agents had been ruthlessly thorough in their systematic dismantling of her life. Her boutique real estate firm, which was the glittering crown jewel of her illicit laundering operations, was permanently shuttered and wrapped in bright yellow crime scene tape. The state regulatory board had instantly and formally suspended her broker's license pending the massive criminal investigation, rendering her entirely unemployable. Her passports, including the secondary European citizenship she had quietly procured for emergencies, were seized by a stern federal judge who had correctly deemed her an extreme flight risk. When she had tried to buy a cheap cup of black coffee at a corner bodega immediately after her release, the transaction was harshly declined. Every single bank account, both corporate and personal, had been entirely drained and frozen by the United States government. She possessed absolutely nothing. But the absolute financial ruin paled in comparison to the severe psychological devastation she had endured during her grueling 48-hour interrogation. The federal prosecutors had not needed to use aggressive intimidation tactics or raise their voices. They simply slid a sleek digital tablet across the cold metal table in the stark interrogation room and pressed play. Blair had sat in stunned, breathless silence, listening to the crystal-clear audio recording of Carter's desperate phone call from his holding cell. She heard the man she loved, the man whose child she was currently carrying, eagerly and viciously throw her directly under the federal bus. She heard him swear to the authorities that he would gladly testify against her, begging to trade her freedom for a lenient plea deal. He had offered her up like a worthless sacrificial lamb, attempting to pin the entire complex money laundering operation exclusively on her shoulders. The ultimate betrayal fractured her fragile psyche, pushing her rapidly descending spiral into pure, unhinged madness. Betrayed, completely broke, and heavily pregnant, Blair was consumed by a toxic, blinding rage. Her meticulously curated world had been obliterated by the quiet, unassuming accountant she had so deeply despised and openly mocked. Riley was the master architect of this absolute destruction. Riley had the untainted millions, the legal immunity, and the victorious escape, while Blair was left holding the ashes of a federal indictment. Driven by pure venomous desperation, Blair pawned the only valuable item she had managed to conceal during her arrest, which was a platinum tennis bracelet shoved deep into her jacket pocket for a tiny fraction of its true worth. She used the dirty, untraceable cash to hire a disgraced private investigator, demanding he locate Riley's new secure residential address through whatever illicit means necessary. Within hours, the investigator handed her an address located in an exclusive, highly secure gated community on the opposite side of the state. Blair rented a battered, unmarked sedan and drove for hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles bruised purple. She arrived at the towering wrought iron gates of the pristine neighborhood just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. The security presence was heavy, manned by armed guards who strictly verified every visitor and cross-referenced license plates. Blair did not have the patience, the clearance, or the sanity for standard protocol. She parked the sedan illegally on the gravel shoulder of the adjacent highway, navigating the dense wooded perimeter entirely on foot. Sharp branches tore at her clothes and scratched her bare arms, but she ignored the stinging physical pain fueled entirely by raw adrenaline and obsessive spite. She found a slight gap in the secondary service fencing and squeezed her pregnant frame through the narrow opening, bypassing the formidable security gate completely. She marched down the quiet, manicured streets, her eyes scanning the brass house numbers until she found the correct property. It was a beautiful, sprawling, modern home surrounded by high privacy hedges representing a fortress of tranquility that mocked her completely ruined existence. Blair stomped up the paver walkway, her breathing ragged and heavy, her eyes wild and bloodshot. She reached the thick, solid oak front door and began pounding against the wood with both closed fists. The violent, aggressive thudding echoed through the quiet suburban evening, disrupting the peaceful neighborhood. Blair ignored the stinging pain radiating through her hands, striking the door with the full, unrestrained force of her desperation. She shrieked Riley's name, her voice cracking and raw, demanding that she immediately open the door and face her. She screamed about the profound betrayal, about the frozen bank accounts, about the fact that her unborn child was now destined to be born to a convicted federal inmate. She sobbed hysterically, her chest heaving as she hurled vicious, venomous insults into the cool evening air. She demanded that Riley fix the unimaginable hell she had orchestrated, screaming that she would not leave until she got her life back. The manic, unyielding pounding continued, a fierce physical manifestation of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, violently throwing herself against the impenetrable fortress of the woman who had finally won. The violent, unyielding pounding against the thick oak of my front door vibrated through the floorboards of the foyer, creating a chaotic rhythm of pure, unfiltered desperation. Inside my fortress, the atmosphere remained utterly serene. I handed my peacefully sleeping son to Jamal, who stood a few paces behind me in the softly lit corridor. He offered a silent, reassuring nod, his phone already pressed firmly to his ear, as he quietly dispatched the local authorities. I smoothed the lapels of my cashmere cardigan, took one deep, cleansing breath of the conditioned air, and reached for the heavy brass handle. I swung the door open, stepping out onto the porch, exposing the frantic woman outside to the warm light of the entryway. The aggressive thudding ceased instantly, as Blair stumbled forward, her momentum carrying her over the threshold before she caught herself. She looked absolutely nothing like the glittering, diamond-draped socialite who had sneered at me in the glass conference room just days prior. The oversized, wrinkled gray sweatshirt swallowed her frame. Her normally immaculate hair was a tangled, wind-blown bird's nest, and her face was streaked with running mascara and the dirt of the surrounding woods she had just crawled through. The second her bloodshot eyes met my calm, untouchable gaze, the venomous rage that had fueled her destructive trek completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a grotesque, performative despair. Her knees buckled outward and she collapsed heavily onto the hard concrete of the front porch. She sank down until she was practically groveling at my feet, deliberately and aggressively thrusting her pregnant belly forward. She was actively using her unborn child as a physical shield, a manipulative prop designed to extract a mercy she had never once shown me. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her dirty fingernails scraping against the stone, reaching out to grasp the hem of my trousers. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, refusing to let her toxic touch contaminate me. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she launched into a frantic, pathetic monologue begging for mercy. She sobbed wildly, pleading with me to formally withdraw my whistleblower testimony from the federal docket. When my expression remained completely devoid of sympathy, she pivoted her strategy, begging me to alter my official statement to the United States Attorney. She demanded I testify that Carter was a tyrannical mastermind who controlled every single aspect of the illicit operation. She wanted me to officially declare on the federal record that she was nothing more than a naive, manipulated employee, entirely oblivious to the massive financial fraud happening right under her nose. She shrieked about her baby, clutching her stomach with both hands, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. She painted a grim picture of delivering her child behind the bars of a federal penitentiary, swearing that she was just following Carter's terrifying orders and had no idea where the vast sums of money were actually originating from. She pleaded for a shred of human decency, asking me to save her and her child from a life of total ruin. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman writhing on my porch, staring at my former best friend with absolute freezing clarity. She was entirely incapable of accepting a single ounce of personal responsibility. Even now, facing absolute ruin, she believed she could weaponize my empathy, relying on the soft, accommodating friend she used to manipulate with ease. There was no pity left inside my chest. The ultimate betrayal she and my ex-husband had inflicted had burned away any lingering affection, leaving behind an impenetrable core of solid ice. I did not see a victim. I saw a greedy, calculated co-conspirator who had gladly funded her lavish materialistic lifestyle with the stolen life savings of innocent, hardworking people. Without breaking eye contact, I reached backward onto the polished console table sitting just inside the foyer. My fingers found the smooth, cool surface of a thick manila file folder I had prepared exactly for this inevitable confrontation. I stepped forward and casually dropped it into the cool evening air. It hit the concrete directly at Blair's knees with a heavy, definitive smack. The impact sent the unclasped flap flying open, spilling dozens of high-resolution, color-coded documents across the porch. Blair's frantic sobbing hitched in her throat as she looked down at the scattered papers. They were heavily encrypted internal bank transfers, private routing numbers, and deeply incriminating chat logs that I had meticulously salvaged from their deleted servers. They explicitly proved that she deliberately established those phantom shell corporations. The documents highlighted how she systematically and knowingly pocketed stolen investor commissions, routing the illicit funds directly into her private offshore accounts. She was not manipulated. She was the eager architect of the laundering process. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into her wide, terrified eyes. My voice was chillingly calm, cutting cleanly through the quiet night air. You once said I was boring with numbers. Those numbers are sending you to federal prison. Before she could attempt another hysterical denial, the shrill, piercing wail of approaching sirens sliced through the serene suburban atmosphere. Brilliant flashing beams of red and blue light rapidly washed over the towering privacy hedges and illuminated the long paved driveway. Jamal stepped up to the threshold behind me, his protective presence a silent confirmation that the authorities had been listening to her unhinged ranting since the moment she breached the perimeter. Two sleek, heavily marked police cruisers aggressively jumped the curb, coming to a screeching halt directly in front of the house. Four uniformed officers piled out of the vehicles, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts as they quickly swarmed the front lawn. They did not hesitate, marching directly up the walkway toward the porch. Blair scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the concrete as she tried to retreat, but there was nowhere left to run. The lead officer barked a sharp command, informing her that she was currently trespassing on private property and actively harassing a protected federal witness. He coldly explained that her aggressive, unhinged ambush was a direct, irrefutable violation of the strict bail conditions she had signed just hours ago. Her bond was instantly and permanently revoked. The officers hauled her up from the ground, ignoring her renewed shrieks and desperate thrashing, and locked the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. I stood perfectly still on my porch, watching with absolute detachment as she was arrested on the spot and shoved roughly into the back of the cruiser. The flashing lights of the police cruiser faded into the quiet suburban night, taking Blair and the last remnants of my old life with them. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend, turned my back on the empty street, walked inside, and firmly locked the heavy oak door. The silence of the house wrapped around me, a comforting blanket of absolute safety. 2 mornings later, the crisp, bright sunlight offered a stark, beautiful contrast to the darkness of that porch encounter. I was carefully maneuvering my son's stroller across the freshly paved asphalt of his pediatrician's parking lot. It was meant to be a standard, mundane wellness check, a quiet, completely normal milestone for my newborn son. I had just unlatched the heavy protective car seat from its base, turning to secure it into the back of my SUV, when the frantic crunch of gravel and the sudden aggressive screech of tires abruptly shattered the morning calm. A silver sedan swerved dangerously close to my bumper tires, smoking slightly as it boxed me in against the manicured hedges lining the medical plaza. Before the engine even cut off, the doors flew open. I instinctively stepped in front of the car seat, my heart hammering against my ribs, bracing myself for another unhinged physical attack. Instead, 3 figures scrambled out of the vehicle, looking less like a coordinated threat and more like a frantic, desperate mob. It was Carter's parents, trailed closely by his older sister Nicole. The suffocating, haughty arrogance they had worn like impenetrable armor at every agonizing family dinner over the past 4 years had been completely incinerated. They looked haggard, their expensive designer clothes rumpled and mismatched, their faces pale drawn and heavily lined with severe exhaustion. The towering superiority complex they had consistently wielded to make me feel small, inadequate, and utterly insignificant was entirely gone, replaced by a feverish, wide-eyed panic. They rushed toward me, their hands outstretched completely, ignoring basic boundaries as they crowded me against the side of my vehicle, cutting off my only avenue of retreat. My former mother-in-law, a woman who had once callously criticized the carat weight of my engagement ring and openly questioned my professional pedigree over expensive champagne, was a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. She lunged forward, attempting to grab my forearm with trembling, manicured hands. I sharply recoiled, holding my palm up in a silent, absolute command to stop. She crumpled her shoulders, shaking violently as she wept openly in the middle of the busy medical plaza, completely abandoning her fiercely guarded patrician dignity. She choked out my name, the sound wet, ragged, and entirely pathetic. She begged me to look at our supposedly deep shared history, conveniently amnesiac to the stark reality that our history consisted entirely of her actively belittling my forensic accounting career and treating me as a temporary inadequate incubator for her precious son's legacy. She was frantic, her expensive mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her cheeks, pleading with me to somehow access the federal escrow accounts. She demanded through desperate, choking sobs that I use my specialized skills to quietly funnel their frozen, seized retirement funds back into their private offshore accounts. She acted as if I possessed a magic wand that could effortlessly override a Department of Justice mandate and circumvent the Federal Bureau of Investigation, utterly delusional to the fact that I was the exact person who had legally dismantled their golden parachute. When her desperate, illogical demands for an immediate financial rescue met my unwavering silent stare, she abruptly shifted her tactics. She deployed the absolute lowest, most manipulative form of emotional warfare available to her. She leaned to the side, straining her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of my sleeping son through the breathable mesh canopy of his car seat. She clasped her hands together in a frantic prayer-like gesture, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that caused passing pedestrians to stop and stare. She wailed that my child was completely innocent, that he desperately needed his grandparents, and that I was cruelly, vindictively severing him from his rightful father's family. She spun a tragic, completely fabricated narrative of a loving, deeply connected family unit being torn apart by an unfeeling ex-wife attempting to weaponize my newborn son to extract the money she valued above all else. She boldly claimed that depriving my child of the lavish, privileged lifestyle their tainted money could provide was a form of profound maternal abuse. She was utterly, completely blind to the reality that their generational wealth was built entirely on the shattered lives and stolen pensions of defrauded, hard-working investors. Carter's father stood just behind her, a hollowed-out shell of the domineering patriarch he had always pretended to be. He stared at the pavement, unable to look me in the eye, silently complicit in his wife's unhinged manipulation, just as he had been silently complicit in his son's sprawling criminal enterprise. Before the echoes of her mother's hypocritical sobbing could fade into the morning air, Nicole pushed her way to the front, eagerly claiming her own piece of the victimhood pie. Nicole, who had never worked a legitimate day in her life, surviving entirely on the fraudulent six-figure allowances Carter had routinely skimmed from his Cypriot shell companies, looked absolutely unhinged. She wasn't crying over her brother's impending lengthy prison sentence or her parents' absolute financial ruin. She was entirely consumed by the catastrophic overnight evaporation of her elite social standing. She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the brick facade of the pediatrician's office, about how she had been abruptly and publicly dropped from the prestigious Charity Gala steering committee. She stomped her foot on the asphalt, crying about how her exclusive country club membership had been permanently suspended pending the federal investigation, and how her influential, wealthy friends were ignoring her frantic calls. She pointed an accusing, trembling finger directly at my chest, crying about how the scandal had utterly destroyed her immaculate reputation in the city. She demanded to know how she was supposed to show her face at the upcoming seasonal yacht club events, completely selfishly oblivious to the fact that her entire family was currently facing decades of federal incarceration. She blamed me entirely for the loss of her luxurious, pampered existence, demanding that I fix the public relations nightmare I had supposedly created, completely incapable of directing her anger at the brother who had stolen the money she so freely spent. I let her piercing, frantic voice hang in the morning air for a fraction of a second before I casually swatted her trembling, manicured finger away from my personal space. I did not raise my volume, but the icy, measured cadence of my words stopped her hysterical tirade instantly. "You really should be careful with how you choose to speak to me, Nicole," I stated, my gaze sweeping slowly over her ruined, wrinkled designer ensemble. "After all, at that lovely, extravagant family dinner just last month, your mother explicitly stated that I lacked the fundamental pedigree to understand the complexities of high-level wealth. Your father confidently chimed in, claiming my small-minded financial naivety was a direct liability to Carter's grand visionary enterprise. You all sat around that massive mahogany dining table, sipping $1,000 wine paid for by stolen pensions, and openly mocked my conservative, boring approach to money. I took a deliberate step toward my former mother-in-law, who was now clutching her chest, gasping for oxygen like a fish thrown onto dry land. You demanded I blindly trust his unmatched financial genius. You wanted me to bow down and respect the magnificent empire your golden boy built. Well, I did exactly what you asked. I examined his unprecedented genius under a microscopic forensic lens. And do you know what I found buried deep within those complex, high-yield accounts you were so intensely arrogantly proud of? I paused, letting the crushing, inescapable weight of their impending reality settle over the asphalt. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Your brilliant son did not invest your massive retirement funds into diversified, secure offshore portfolios. He blindly gambled every single cent of your generational wealth on fabricated, non-existent shell properties in Cyprus just to cover the massive, bleeding financial holes in his domestic Ponzi scheme. The blood completely drained from the older man's face. He swayed dangerously on his feet, reaching out to lean heavily against the side of my SUV for physical support. I turned my attention directly to him, methodically dismantling the very last remnants of his patriarchal pride. There is no hidden reserve of money to funnel back to you. The accounts are not just temporarily frozen, they have been permanently seized. The federal government is legally and ruthlessly liquidating whatever pathetic, fraudulent scraps remain of Carter's hollow empire to pay back the actual legitimate victims he defrauded. The hard-working, honest people whose entire lives he actively and maliciously ruined. You are not victims in the eyes of the Department of Justice. You are simply collateral damage. You are permanently, irreversibly bankrupt, and there is absolutely nothing I can or will do to save you from the suffocating poverty your own son deliberately engineered. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my declaration was violently punctured by the sharp mechanical click of a car door unlatching. The driver's side door of my SUV swung open, and Jamal stepped out onto the pavement. He looked impeccably sharp, his posture rigid with an intense, contained fury that was entirely different from my cold, calculating detachment. He walked slowly around the hood of the vehicle, his dark eyes locked firmly on Nicole, who immediately took a hopeful, desperate step towards him. She reached out with both hands, clearly expecting her husband to defend her, to wrap his arms around her and shield her from the brutal, unyielding reality I had just delivered. Jamal did not offer her a comforting embrace. He stopped a full 3 feet away from her, radiating an impenetrable, furious barrier that made her flinch. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. Without a single word of greeting, he thrust it forcefully into Nicole's chest, forcing her to grab it before it hit the ground. She looked down at the heavy packet, utter confusion, temporarily overriding her rampant panic, before snapping her gaze back up to his unyielding, stony face. "Those are divorce papers," Nicole Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute uncompromising finality. "Signed, filed, and completely non-negotiable." Nicole gasped, dropping the envelope onto the asphalt as if it had physically burned her palms. She stammered frantically, trying to weave a new, desperate web of excuses, begging him to explain, crying that she needed him now more than ever because her world was collapsing. Jamal simply shook his head, a gesture of profound, exhausted disgust. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim today," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, instantly silencing her pathetic theatrics. "Did you honestly believe I would not notice a massive unauthorized wire transfer draining our joint savings account? Did you truly think I was too stupid to trace the routing numbers you so desperately and clumsily tried to bury?" He stepped closer, forcing her to shrink back against her quietly weeping mother. "You secretly funneled my hard-earned money funds I generated through honest, legitimate, exhausting work directly into a legal defense retainer for your criminal brother. You deliberately stole from your own husband to bail out a federal felon who had already utterly ruined your parents. You compromised our entire financial future, lying directly to my face for days, just to protect a man who would gladly sell you out to the prosecutors to shave a single month off his inevitable prison sentence." Nicole opened her mouth, dark, mascara tears streaming down her pale face, but no sound emerged. The undeniable, shameful truth of her betrayal hung heavily in the air, stripping away her final flimsy defense. Jamal turned his back on her, his broad shoulders conveying absolute permanent dismissal. "I am completely, entirely done," he announced, his voice carrying not just to Nicole, but to her shattered, ruined parents. "I am officially severing all ties with this toxic, parasitic family. You have fed off each other's grand delusions and insatiable greed for decades, and I absolutely refuse to be dragged down into the federal abyss with you. Do not call me. Do not text me. Direct all future communication exclusively to my attorney." Jamal walked back to the driver's side of the SUV, opening the door and sliding behind the wheel without a single backward glance. I looked at the three broken figures huddled together in the parking lot. The haughty, untouchable dynasty had been reduced to a weeping, utterly ruined mess of their own arrogant making. I turned smoothly on my heel, ensuring my son's car seat was perfectly secure before shutting the rear door. I slid into the passenger seat, the heavy door closing with a satisfying, definitive thud that perfectly sealed out their desperate wails. Jamal shifted the car into gear, steering smoothly out of the medical plaza. We merged onto the busy main road, driving away into the bright, promising morning, leaving the in-laws standing stranded in the sprawling asphalt lot, with absolutely nothing left to their names. The bright, promising morning we drove into that day seamlessly stretched into a year of relentless, transformative momentum. 365 days later, the chaotic desperation of that medical plaza parking lot felt like an entirely different lifetime, lived by a woman I hardly recognized anymore. I sat behind a massive custom-built mahogany desk, the smooth, polished surface cool and grounding beneath my fingertips. The expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly established accounting firm flooded the corner executive suite with brilliant, unyielding afternoon sunlight. The panoramic view of the bustling downtown skyline served as a daily, tangible reminder of the empire I had successfully built from the ashes of their deceit. My firm, specializing in forensic audits, corporate compliance, and complex financial recovery, had exploded in prestige and success, ironically propelled by the high-profile reputation I had earned dismantling Carter's illicit operation. The quiet, synchronized hum of productivity echoed beyond my frosted glass doors, a symphony of legitimate, hard-earned triumph. My attention, however, was anchored exclusively to the sleek, ultra-high-definition television mounted seamlessly into the opposite wall of my office. The volume was kept to a reasonable, civilized murmur, yet the local news anchor's polished, urgent voice filled the spacious room with absolute crystalline clarity. The sprawling, highly publicized federal trial had officially reached its final conclusion. Months of exhausting grand jury testimonies, endless closed-door depositions, and aggressive sensationalized media coverage had culminated in this precise moment. I leaned back into the plush leather of my ergonomic chair, crossing my legs as the broadcast cut to live, high-resolution footage from the imposing stone steps of the federal courthouse. The breaking news graphic flashing across the bottom of the screen read in bold, unforgiving letters, "Local financial architect sentenced." Carter's face flashed across the screen. The footage captured him being escorted out of the heavy courthouse doors by a phalanx of heavily armed U.S. Marshals. He was stripped entirely of his bespoke Italian suits, his expensive haircuts, and the smug, untouchable aura of superiority he had worn like a second skin for a decade. Clad in a shapeless drab khaki jumpsuit, his wrists firmly secured in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a belly chain, he looked incredibly small, physically aged, and utterly broken. The anchor confirmed the presiding judge's ruling without a single ounce of journalistic sympathy. Carter had been officially sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The charges were ironclad, irrefutable, and devastating multiple counts of aggravated securities fraud and extensive wire fraud. The judge had delivered a scathing public reprimand from the bench, condemning his systematic, predatory exploitation of innocent investors and explicitly stripping him of any possibility for early parole. The architect of my former misery was now permanently caged, his arrogant criminal mind locked away for the next decade and a half. The broadcast swiftly transitioned to the primary co-conspirator. Blair's sentencing report immediately followed. The news station displayed a detailed courtroom sketch of her weeping hysterically before the unamused judge, a stark, pathetic contrast to the glittering, diamond-draped socialite she had once so desperately pretended to be. Her performative despair, relentless sobbing, and frantic attempts to paint herself as a manipulated, naive victim acting under duress had completely failed to sway the federal prosecutors. The undeniable mountain of encrypted chat logs and offshore routing numbers I had salvaged proved to be the definitive nails in her legal coffin. She was handed a brutal 8-year sentence in a federal correctional institution for criminal conspiracy and aggressive money laundering. The anchor briefly noted the tragic collateral damage of her choices, confirming that her infant was currently residing in the custody of the state, as her immediate family lacked the clean background checks required for placement. The phantom shell corporations she had so eagerly and greedily architected had ultimately bought her nearly a decade behind bars. The judicial purge did not stop at the primary offenders. It bled outward, consuming those who had silently enabled the empire. The Department of Justice had been ruthlessly, meticulously thorough in their asset forfeiture protocols, ripping through the family's ill-gotten generational wealth like a Category 5 hurricane. The news segment shifted to highlight this exact collateral damage, showing aerial helicopter footage of the seizure of the sprawling, gated suburban estate that Carter's parents had lorded over for years. The massive opulent property, along with their fleet of luxury vehicles, private club shares, and frozen offshore accounts, had been aggressively seized and liquidated to provide fractional restitution to the defrauded victims. I knew through the tight-knit legal grapevine exactly where that uncompromising liquidation had left them. Stripped of their stolen millions, their elite memberships, and their insufferable pride, my former in-laws had been unceremoniously evicted by federal agents. They were currently residing in a cramped, poorly insulated, low-income apartment complex on the crumbling industrial outskirts of the city. The people who had once haughtily sneered at my middle-class upbringing and demanded I respect their elite pedigree were now quietly standing in line at the local food bank, entirely forgotten and shunned by the high society friends who had instantly abandoned them the moment the federal indictments dropped. I muted the television with a single click of the remote, letting the serene silence of my sunlit office wash over me. I took a deep, cleansing breath, closing my eyes and analyzing the steady, calm, perfectly normal rhythm of my own heartbeat. I waited for a sudden surge of vindictive joy, a flash of lingering, dormant anger, or perhaps even a fleeting shadow of sorrow for the absolute destruction of a family I had once married into. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void in my chest was not born of trauma or numbness, but of profound, unshakable, permanent peace. The burning, impenetrable core of solid ice that had shielded me during the darkest, most dangerous days of the betrayal had melted away completely, leaving behind a clean, pristine, untainted slate. Sitting there in the warmth of the afternoon sun, I felt exactly like a skilled surgeon who had meticulously and successfully cut a malignant toxic tumor out of a healthy body. The disease was entirely eradicated. The necrotic tissue had been excised, discarded, and incinerated. The patient was completely cured, breathing freely and thriving. The heavy glass door to my executive suite clicked open, breaking my reverie, and Jamal stepped inside. He looked impeccably sharp in a navy suit, holding 2 steaming cups of artisanal coffee, a relaxed, genuine smile illuminating his handsome face. He glanced at the muted television screen, noting the frozen image of the courthouse, then looked back to me, his dark eyes silently asking the question. I nodded slowly, a matching, effortless smile naturally curving my lips. It was finally, truly over. The toxic chapter of my past was permanently sealed, legally concluded, and locked away behind federal steel. I took the coffee from his outstretched hand, turning my chair away from the screen and back toward the expansive windows. The city spread out before me, vast, bright, and brimming with endless, untainted possibilities. The city spread out before me, vast, bright, and brimming with endless, untainted possibilities. Exactly 1 week after the gavel fell on the final sentencing, the crowning validation of my meticulous, solitary labor arrived in the form of a thick, certified federal envelope. It was hand-delivered to the front desk of my firm by a uniformed courier bearing the distinct eagle-embossed seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Sitting at my polished mahogany desk, I sliced open the heavy parchment with a silver letter opener. The language inside was beautifully dry, mathematically precise, and gloriously bureaucratic. Under the official, highly guarded stipulations of the United States Whistleblower Reward Program, private individuals who provide original, actionable information leading directly to successful federal enforcement are entitled to a substantial financial bounty. The documents explicitly outline the sheer scale of the asset recovery. My encrypted chat logs, salvaged routing numbers, and decoded offshore transfers had facilitated. The Department of Justice, relying entirely on my airtight forensic roadmap, had successfully seized and repatriated exactly $50 million in stolen investor funds. The math was laid out in bold black ink near the bottom of the page. For my direct, indispensable role in dismantling the illicit syndicate, the federal government had awarded me 15% of the total recovered assets, $7.5 million. It was a staggering, astronomical figure. Yet unlike the filthy blood money my ex-husband had frantically hoarded and laundered, this wealth was perfectly legal, fiercely protected, and completely clean. 2 business days later, I watched my private encrypted bank account refresh on my secure monitor. The massive 7-figure sum cleared effortlessly into my name, a silent digital testament to the ultimate payoff of unyielding patience, silent observation, and absolute precision. 6 months later, the tangible, beautiful results of that pristine federal reward were blooming brilliantly under the warm summer sun. I stood on the sprawling, manicured terrace of my newly purchased, highly secure private estate, watching the vibrant celebration unfolding on the lush green lawn below. It was my son's first birthday, a milestone that completely lacked the suffocating performative tension of the past. There were no arrogant socialites sneering over crystal champagne flutes, no toxic in-laws issuing thinly veiled insults, and absolutely no dark criminal secrets lurking beneath the floorboards. Instead, the warm air was filled with genuine, effortless laughter, the bright, uplifting melodies of a live acoustic band, and the delightful chaos of small children chasing iridescent bubbles through the sun-drenched garden. At the absolute center of the joyful commotion was Jamal. He stood near a towering oak tree, effortlessly hoisting my giggling, bright-eyed boy into the air, fully embracing his fiercely protective role as my son's proud, devoted godfather. The intense cold fury he had wielded in that medical plaza parking lot a year prior was entirely gone, completely replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. We were no longer just collateral damage or survivors of a mutual devastating betrayal. We were highly successful equal partners in an elite venture. Funded by my federal bounty and built on our shared specialized expertise, we had officially launched a premier cybersecurity accounting firm. We seamlessly combined his ruthless digital security architecture with my microscopic forensic auditing skills, creating an impenetrable fortress for legitimate corporate clients. We took the exact tools we had used to systematically hunt down and destroy Carter's phantom shell companies and monetize them, building an untouchable ethical empire of our own. I took a slow sip of sparkling water, resting my hand against the cool stone balustrade of the terrace, surveying the beautiful, untainted life I had constructed from the wreckage. The stark contrast between my former existence, trapped in a suffocating marriage, built entirely on fraud, and this absolute, unbothered freedom was magnificent. I watched my son reach down to grab Jamal's nose, his innocent, carefree laughter ringing clear as a bell across the pristine lawn. A profound, chillingly clear realization washed over me, solidifying into absolute, undeniable truth. Family is never simply defined by shared bloodlines, legally binding certificates, or the weight of a heavy diamond wedding ring. Family is forged in the relentless fires of mutual respect, proven loyalty, and the unwavering choice to stand together when the ground drops out from beneath you. The catastrophic betrayal inflicted by my ex-husband and my former best friend had initially felt like a brutal execution, but looking at my thriving son and my flourishing empire, I knew the reality. Betrayal is a rare, spectacular gift, provided you possess the ruthless clarity to use it to take out the trash. Carter had specifically chosen me because I was quiet, unassuming, and deliberately faded into the background. He desperately needed a compliant, boring wife to serve as the perfect, unquestioning cover for his massive, sprawling fraud. He actively sought out a woman he firmly believed did not know how to count the money flowing right under her nose. Unfortunately for his legacy, his freedom, and his entire corrupt bloodline, he crossed a forensic accountant. The story teaches a profound lesson about resilience and the hidden power of being underestimated. When faced with absolute betrayal by those she trusted most, Riley did not succumb to despair or chaotic revenge. Instead, she weaponized her greatest strength, her brilliant analytical mind, to secure undeniable justice and perfectly rebuild her life on her own terms. It proves that our absolute lowest moments can serve as the ultimate catalyst for personal liberation. True family is forged through loyalty and mutual respect, not merely bloodlines or marriage. Always embrace your unique skills to protect your peace, and please comment below.